Consider this uncomfortable truth about your own species. You are, right now, anatomically identical to humans who lived 300,000 years ago. Your brain, in its structure and capacity, is the same brain that emerged in what is now Morocco, at a site called Jebel Irhoud, when our species first appeared on this planet. But here's what's really disturbing. For roughly 190,000 years after that emergence, those humans, your cognitive equals, left almost no trace of what we would recognize as culture. No cave paintings, no complex tools beyond simple stone implements, no jewelry, no burial rituals suggesting symbolic thought, no evidence of language sophisticated enough to transmit abstract ideas across generations. Picture this: anatomically modern humans, with brains capable of composing symphonies and building spacecraft, spending nearly 200 millennia in what appears to be cognitive silence. Not because the fossil record is incomplete. The evidence is there. It's the achievements that are missing. And here's where it gets interesting. Around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, something changed. Not gradually. Almost simultaneously across the globe, humans began creating art, crafting sophisticated tools, burying their dead with ceremony, carving figurines, painting on cave walls. Archaeologists call it the creative explosion. Some call it the Great Leap Forward. The same brains that had existed for 250,000 years suddenly began producing culture, symbol, meaning. Think about that for a moment. What broke the silence? What threshold did we cross? This isn't a gap in the fossil record. It's a gap in human achievement that science cannot fully explain. We had the hardware for 190,000 years. Something else had to awaken before we could use it. What were we waiting for? What invisible barrier held us back, and what finally allowed us to break through? Tonight, we explore the gaps that haunt human prehistory, the silences between the noise, the dormant potential that suddenly ignited. Before we venture deeper into these ancient silences, let me acknowledge something. Many of you are settling in for the night right now, letting these mysteries carry you towards sleep. Others are beginning your day, listening as morning light fills your window. We are a global community of explorers, drawn to the same questions across different hours. Whether you're watching from Tokyo as dawn breaks, London in the afternoon light, or Los Angeles at midnight, you're part of this journey together. If you'd like, share your city and local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know we're all wondering about the same mysteries, separated by time zones, but connected by curiosity. And if this resonates with you, consider subscribing. You're not just joining a channel, you're joining a community of people who find peace in pondering the deepest questions about who we are. Now, let us begin where the mystery is deepest. Picture this. It's 200,000 years ago, somewhere in the grasslands of eastern Africa. The sun hangs low on the horizon, painting the acacia trees in gold. A small group moves through the landscape, perhaps 20 individuals, 3 generations traveling together. Watch them carefully. Their posture is upright, fully modern. Their hands, dexterous and capable, grip simple stone tools. Their eyes scan the environment with intelligence, noting the movement of prey animals, the location of water sources, the subtle signs that predict tomorrow's weather. If you could see their faces up close, you would recognize them instantly. High foreheads, prominent chins, the same facial structure you see in the mirror every morning. Their brains, if we could measure them, would be indistinguishable from yours. About 1,350 cubic centimeters. The same size, the same structure, the same potential for abstract thought, language, creativity, innovation. The hardware, as it were, is identical. And yet, if you could travel back further to 300,000 years ago, or even to 1,000,000 years before that moment, you would see their ancestors doing essentially the same things, using the same tools, following the same patterns, living lives that would be almost indistinguishable from the scene unfolding before you. This is where the mystery deepens. For approximately 190,000 years, anatomically modern humans existed on this planet and left behind almost nothing that suggests behavioral modernity. No explosion of innovation, no rapid cultural evolution, no clear evidence of the symbolic thinking that defines us today. The archaeological record from this period is not sparse because we haven't looked hard enough. It's sparse because there simply wasn't much happening. Think about that for a moment. 190,000 years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian cuneiform tablets to this moment right now, spans only about 5,000 years. The entire rise and fall of ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the Digital Age, all of it fits into a tiny sliver at the end of our species' timeline. Multiply that entire span by 38, and you're still not at 190,000 years. That's how long we waited. That's how long beings with brains identical to ours lived without producing much of what we would recognize as human culture. Here's what we know for certain. The human brain reached its modern size approximately 300,000 years ago. The evidence comes from multiple fossil sites, but the clearest early examples are from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, where skulls dated to around 315,000 years ago show cranial capacities within the range of modern humans. These weren't primitive proto-humans. These were us, at least in terms of raw cognitive hardware. And for the next 250,000 years, the archaeological record shows remarkable stasis. Consider the Acheulean hand axe. This is one of the most successful tools in human history, not because it was particularly sophisticated, but because it barely changed for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The Acheulean tool industry began approximately 1.76 million years ago and continued until roughly 130,000 years ago. That's 1.6 million years of making essentially the same tool. Let that number settle in your mind. 1.6 million years. These hand axes were teardrop-shaped stones, carefully flaked on both sides to create a sharp edge. They were versatile, useful for cutting meat, scraping hides, digging roots, processing plant materials. They worked, and because they worked, they didn't change. Generation after generation, for longer than we can truly comprehend, humans made the same tool in the same way. Even after anatomically modern humans emerged with their modern-sized brains, they continued making Acheulean hand axes. The innovation didn't come from having bigger brains. The brains were already there, fully formed, fully capable. Something else was missing. But here's what's really puzzling. We know these early humans were capable of complex behavior. The evidence is scattered and sparse, but it's there, like whispers in the archaeological record, suggesting that the capacity for symbolic thought existed even if it wasn't regularly expressed. At Pinnacle Point, South Africa, we find evidence of shellfish harvesting dated to 164,000 years ago. This matters because collecting shellfish requires understanding tidal patterns, planning around lunar cycles, coordinating group activities around predictable environmental rhythms. It's not just opportunistic scavenging. It's systematic exploitation of a resource that requires knowledge transmitted across generations. The same site shows evidence of heat treatment of stone tools around 162,000 years ago. This is sophisticated technology. You have to understand that heating certain types of stone changes their properties, makes them easier to work, allows for finer, sharper edges. This isn't accidental. It requires experimentation, understanding of material properties, teaching the technique to others. And then there's Blombos Cave, also in South Africa, where archaeologists found pieces of ochre, a red mineral pigment, engraved with abstract geometric patterns. The date, 77,000 years ago. These aren't random scratches, they're deliberate, repeated patterns, cross-hatching, parallel lines, designs that suggest symbolic thinking, the ability to represent ideas through abstract marks. This is art, or at least it's the precursor to art. It's evidence that the cognitive capacity for symbolic representation existed in human minds 77,000 years ago. But here's the thing, these finds are exceptional, precisely because they're so rare. Blombos Cave is famous because it's one of the only sites from this period showing this kind of symbolic behavior. If early humans were regularly creating art, using symbols, expressing abstract thoughts through material culture, we would find evidence of it everywhere. We don't. The silence is real. Compare that to what happens after about 50,000 years ago. The contrast is so stark it's almost hard to believe we're talking about the same species. Suddenly, the archaeological record explodes with evidence of behavioral modernity. Cave paintings appear across Europe, intricate and sophisticated. Bone flutes show up, suggesting music. Carved figurines, like the Venus of Hohlefels from Germany dated to 40,000 years ago, demonstrate not just artistic skill, but the ability to represent the human form in abstract, symbolic ways. Burial practices become elaborate, with bodies interred with grave goods, suggesting belief in an afterlife or at least ritualized treatment of the dead. Tool technology diversifies rapidly. Specialized implements appear for specific tasks. Trade networks extend across hundreds of miles. Shell beads from the Mediterranean show up in inland sites, indicating exchange systems and social connections across vast distances. All of this happens in what amounts to an eye blink, compared to the 190,000 years that came before. We simply do not know why. Some researchers argue that the change was neurological, that some final rewiring of the brain occurred around 50,000 years ago, enabling fully modern cognition. But the problem with this theory is that the brain was already modern in size and structure hundreds of thousands of years earlier. What could have changed internally that doesn't show up in the fossil record? Others suggest it was demographic. For much of the Middle Stone Age, the Homo sapiens population was remarkably small. Estimates suggest that for long stretches of this period, there may have been only 10,000 to 30,000 individuals of our species alive on the entire planet. Think about that. The entire human population could have fit inside a modern sports stadium. In small, isolated populations, cultural innovations might arise and then disappear when the individuals who knew them died. There's no critical mass to sustain and build upon new ideas. Perhaps what changed wasn't our brains but our numbers. As populations grew and became more interconnected, innovations could spread and accumulate rather than flickering out. This is called the population density hypothesis, and it's compelling. But it doesn't fully explain why the hardware was ready for so long before the software kicked in. Another theory focuses on language. Perhaps anatomically modern humans had language of a sort from early on, but it was simple, concrete, limited to the immediate and practical. Danger there. Food here. Water that way. Useful for survival, but not for transmitting complex cultural knowledge across generations. What if the development of fully syntactic language, with grammar complex enough to express abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, stories about the past, and plans for the future, was the missing piece? Once language reached a certain threshold of complexity, it became possible to accumulate cultural knowledge in a way that wasn't possible before. Ideas could build on other ideas. Innovations could be explained, taught, refined, passed down. But we have no way to know when language reached that threshold. Language doesn't fossilize. We can only infer its presence from the cultural artifacts that require it. The honest answer is that we don't know what broke the silence. The mystery remains unsolved, and it should bother us more than it probably does. Because here's what makes this question so profound. These weren't different creatures. They were us. Same brain, same potential, same capacity for thought and feeling and innovation. If you could somehow transport an infant from 150,000 years ago to the present and raise them in a modern family, they would be indistinguishable from any other child. They would learn to read, use computers, understand mathematics, create art, fall in love, wonder about their place in the universe. The potential was always there. Dormant, latent, waiting for something to unlock it. What does it mean that beings with our exact cognitive hardware lived for so long without producing what we think of as human culture? What does it say about the nature of human potential that it can exist fully formed but unexpressed for thousands of generations? These questions touch something deep and unsettling. We like to think of human progress as inevitable, that given the right cognitive equipment, advancement naturally follows. But the 190,000-year silence suggests otherwise. It suggests that having the capacity for something is not the same as actualizing that capacity. There's a threshold somewhere between potential and realization, and crossing it is not automatic. Consider what was happening during those long millennia. These early humans were surviving, certainly. They were raising children, forming social bonds, navigating complex social hierarchies within their small groups. They were solving the daily problems of finding food, avoiding predators, dealing with environmental changes. They were human in every meaningful sense. But they weren't building. They weren't accumulating cultural knowledge in a way that led to rapid change. Each generation lived much like the one before. The tools they made at the end of their lives were essentially the same as the tools they learned to make as children. It's not that nothing changed. Evolution was still happening. Genetic adaptations were occurring. Populations were moving, adapting to new environments, developing slightly different physical traits. But cultural evolution, the thing that makes human history so dynamic and rapid, was frozen, or perhaps not frozen. Perhaps it was just incredibly, almost imperceptibly slow. A new technique might emerge every few thousand years, a slight refinement in tool-making every 10,000 years. From our perspective, with our historical record of rapid change, it looks like stasis. But perhaps to them, living within it, there was change. Just change on a timescale so gradual that no individual would notice it in their lifetime. The population size matters here, in ways that are hard to overstate. With only 10,000 to 30,000 individuals spread across the African continent, groups would have been small and isolated. Perhaps 50 to 100 people in a band, with little contact with other groups. In such small populations, knowledge is fragile. If the one person who knows how to make a particular tool dies before teaching someone else, that knowledge is lost. If a drought or disease outbreak reduces a group's numbers, cultural knowledge dies with them. Innovation requires not just individual genius, but social structures that can preserve and transmit that genius to others. Perhaps, for most of the Middle Stone Age, human social structures weren't yet complex enough to do that reliably. And this is where the mystery deepens further. Because we know that some groups, in some places, at some times were doing more. The Blombos Cave ochre, the Pinnacle Point heat-treated tools, these aren't fantasies. They're real artifacts, evidence of behavioral sophistication. But they're isolated examples, not part of a continuous tradition that we can trace through time. It's as if the capacity for symbolic thought, for innovation, for cultural complexity would flicker on briefly and then fade again. Like a fire trying to catch in damp wood. Sparks would fly, a small flame would appear, and then it would go out, leaving only smoke and the potential for fire but not fire itself. What finally allowed the fire to catch and spread? We may never know for certain. The answer probably isn't simple. It's likely a combination of factors. Population growth, environmental changes, the development of more sophisticated language, the emergence of more complex social structures that could sustain and transmit cultural innovations. Perhaps all of these things had to come together before the threshold could be crossed. But the fact remains that for 190,000 years, beings with brains identical to ours lived lives that left almost no mark on the archaeological record beyond the most basic evidence of survival. They were human, fully human, and yet they lived in a kind of cultural stasis that we, with our rapidly changing world, can barely imagine. This should humble us. It should make us wonder about our own potential, about what capacities we might have that remain unexpressed, about what thresholds we haven't yet crossed. The silence wasn't absolute, though. Even during those long millennia, there were hints, scattered across time and space, that something was stirring. The engraved ochre at Blombos Cave, the heat-treated tools at Pinnacle Point, shell beads found at sites across Africa suggesting personal adornment and perhaps social signaling. These are glimpses of what was possible, even if it wasn't yet sustained. The hardware was ready, the potential was there. Something was building, slowly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of that long silence. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, everything changed. Picture this. It's 77,000 years ago, and someone is sitting in Blombos Cave on the southern coast of what will one day be South Africa. The cave overlooks the Indian Ocean, and light filters in through the entrance, illuminating a workspace where a craftsperson is engaged in something extraordinary. They're holding a piece of ochre, a red iron-rich stone, but they're not using it to mark their body or color a hide. They're engraving it. With deliberate, careful strokes, they're carving geometric patterns into the surface, cross-hatched lines forming triangles, repeated motifs that suggest planning, intention, design. This isn't accidental scratching. This is symbolic thought made visible. This is art. When archaeologists discovered this engraved ochre in the early 2000s, dated to around 77,000 years ago, they were holding evidence that should have rewritten our understanding of human cognitive development. Because symbolic thought, the ability to create abstract patterns that carry meaning, is one of the hallmarks of behavioral modernity. It's what separates simple tool use from culture, survival from civilization. And here it was, appearing 77,000 years ago. Not 40,000 years ago when the creative explosion supposedly began, 37,000 years earlier. Think about that for a moment. The same site yielded something even more remarkable. Shell beads. Nacerius kraussianus shells, each one carefully perforated, showing signs of wear consistent with being strung together and worn as jewelry. These beads date to approximately 75,000 years ago, making them the oldest known personal ornaments in the archaeological record. The oldest jewelry. Jewelry means something profound. It means someone cared about how they looked to others. It means social signaling, status, identity, belonging. It means a level of self-awareness and social complexity that we associate with fully modern human behavior. These people at Blombus Cave were us, not proto-humans groping toward consciousness. Us, creating art, wearing jewelry, thinking symbolically, living in a world rich with meaning and social complexity. And then it vanished. The engraved ochre stops appearing in the archaeological record. The shell beads disappear. The evidence of this sophisticated symbolic behavior simply ends. Not gradually, as if a tradition slowly faded. It just stops, as if someone turned off a light. Here's what makes this so haunting. We're not talking about one isolated find that might be an anomaly. The pattern repeats. Again and again across southern Africa during this period, we see evidence of behavioral sophistication that appears, flourishes briefly, and then disappears without spreading to other populations or persisting through time. Consider the still bay industry. Around 72,000 years ago, groups in southern Africa were creating bifacial stone points of extraordinary quality. These weren't simple flakes knocked off a core. They were carefully shaped on both sides, symmetrical, elegant, requiring significant skill and planning to produce. They represent a level of craftsmanship and technological knowledge that speaks to sophisticated cognitive abilities. The still bay points appear in the archaeological record around 72,000 BCE. They persist for perhaps 2,000 years, and then they disappear. The tradition ends. The knowledge of how to make them seems to be lost. And then, several thousand years later, the pattern repeats again. The Howisson's port industry emerges around 65,000 years ago. This stone tool tradition represents some of the most sophisticated toolmaking of the entire Middle Stone Age. The signature technology is backed blades, small crescent-shaped stone tools that were probably hafted onto wooden or bone handles to create composite tools. Think of them as the Stone Age equivalent of replaceable razor blades. The concept requires abstract thinking, planning, and an understanding of hafting technologies. These backed blades are remarkably advanced. They're made using a prepared core technique that requires the toolmaker to envision the final product before beginning work. They're small, which means they're efficient with raw materials. They're standardized, suggesting cultural transmission of specific techniques. They represent exactly the kind of innovation and sophistication we associate with behaviorally modern humans. The Howisson's port industry flourishes for about 6,000 years, from roughly 65,000 to 59,000 years ago. Sites across southern Africa show evidence of these tools, and then, like the still bay before it, the tradition disappears. The backed blades stop appearing. The knowledge seems to evaporate. This is the mystery that should keep us awake at night. Not that these innovations appeared, but that they disappeared. Why didn't they spread? Why didn't they persist? These weren't dead-end evolutionary experiments. These were successful technologies, sophisticated cultural practices, evidence of cognitive capabilities identical to our own. And they vanished. Some researchers have proposed that climate catastrophes repeatedly reset human progress during this period. The theory centers on one event in particular, an eruption so massive it may have brought our species to the brink of extinction. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in what is now Indonesia erupted with a force that defies easy comprehension. This wasn't a volcanic eruption in the sense we typically imagine. This was a supervolcano, an explosion that ejected somewhere between 670 and 800 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected about 1 cubic mile of material. Toba was roughly 700 times larger. The eruption would have created a volcanic winter. Ash and sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere would have blocked sunlight, dropping global temperatures by perhaps 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for years. In some regions, the cooling may have been even more severe. Growing seasons would have shortened. Plant life would have suffered. Animal populations would have crashed. And humans, dependent on those ecosystems, would have faced catastrophic food shortages. Some researchers, most notably Stanley Ambrose, have proposed that the Toba eruption reduced the global human population to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. A genetic bottleneck so severe that all living humans today are descended from that tiny surviving population. The evidence comes from genetic studies showing that modern humans have remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other great apes, suggesting our population went through a severe constriction at some point. Think about what that means. If the Toba catastrophe theory is correct, then at the very moment when humans at Blombos Cave were creating art and wearing jewelry, when the still bay industry was producing its beautiful bifacial points, our species was teetering on the edge of extinction. And when Toba erupted around 74,000 years ago, right in the middle of this period of cultural fluorescence, it may have wiped out most of those populations. The innovations didn't fail to spread because they weren't useful. They disappeared because the people who carried them died. The knowledge was lost because there was no one left to pass it on to. The pattern we see in the archaeological record, innovations appearing and then vanishing, might not be a pattern of cultural failure. It might be a pattern of demographic collapse. Each time a population developed something sophisticated, environmental catastrophe struck and reduced numbers to the point where cultural transmission broke down. But here's where the theory gets complicated, where the certainty dissolves into debate and uncertainty. The Toba catastrophe theory, while compelling, is far from universally accepted. Some researchers point out that the genetic evidence for a bottleneck is ambiguous. The low genetic diversity in modern humans could be explained by other factors, including the way our ancestors migrated out of Africa in small groups, repeatedly founding new populations from limited genetic stock. Others note that archaeological sites in Africa and Asia show continuity across the Toba eruption date. If the eruption had reduced humanity to a few thousand individuals, we might expect to see more dramatic breaks in the archaeological record. Instead, at many sites, the tool traditions continue essentially unchanged before and after 74,000 years ago. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. We have clear proof that Toba erupted with unprecedented force. We have genetic evidence suggesting our population went through some kind of bottleneck. We have archaeological evidence of innovations appearing and disappearing during this general time period. But connecting all these pieces into a single coherent narrative requires making assumptions that not all researchers are willing to make. What we can say with certainty is this. During the period from roughly 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, human populations in Africa were doing something remarkable. They were innovating, they were creating, they were demonstrating cognitive capabilities that mark them as behaviorally modern. And those innovations were fragile. Consider Sabudu Cave, another site in South Africa that has yielded extraordinary evidence of early human sophistication. Here, archaeologists have found compound adhesives dating to around 100,000 years ago. These are not simple sticky substances found in nature. These are manufactured adhesives created by heating plant resins and mixing them with ochre and other materials to create a compound that could be used to haft stone tools to wooden handles. The process of making these adhesives requires fire control, knowledge of material properties, the ability to maintain specific temperature ranges during heating, and an understanding of chemistry that we would consider sophisticated even by modern standards. This is not simple trial and error. This is transmitted cultural knowledge, probably requiring verbal instruction and demonstration 100,000 years ago. Compound adhesives, chemistry, cultural transmission. And like the engraved ochre, like the shell beads, like the still bay points and the Howiesen's port-back blades, this technology appears in the record and then fades. It doesn't spread across the continent. It doesn't become a universal human technology. It flickers and goes out. The pattern repeats. Each time we find evidence of these early innovations, we're seeing a spark. A moment when a group of humans somewhere in Africa crossed a threshold. They developed something new, something sophisticated, something that required and demonstrated cognitive capabilities we recognize as fully modern. They were reaching for something. They were building culture, creating meaning, solving problems with ingenuity and creativity. And each time, the spark failed to catch. The innovation remained local, persisted for a few thousand years at most, and then disappeared. Not because it wasn't valuable. Not because the people who created it weren't smart enough or capable enough. But because the conditions weren't right for it to spread and be sustained. Population size matters here in ways that are easy to underestimate. With only 10,000 to 30,000 humans spread across the entire African continent, populations would have been small and isolated. A band of 50 people here, 100 people there, separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Contact between groups would have been rare. The exchange of ideas and technologies would have been limited. In such small, isolated populations, knowledge is ephemeral. If the one person who knows how to make compound adhesive dies in a hunting accident before fully teaching the technique to the next generation, that knowledge is lost. If a drought forces a group to abandon their territory and migrate, they might leave behind the raw materials and environmental knowledge necessary for their technologies. If a disease outbreak or a conflict with a neighboring group reduces population numbers, cultural practices can disappear simply because there aren't enough people left to maintain them. Innovation requires not just individual genius, but social structures that can preserve and transmit that genius across generations and across space. Perhaps during this long period, human social networks weren't yet robust enough to do that reliably. The sparks were there. The potential was there. But the kindling wasn't dry enough. The wind wasn't right, the fuel wasn't sufficient to let the fire catch and spread. And perhaps climate catastrophes, whether Toba or other environmental crises we haven't yet identified, repeatedly reset the process. Each time a population began to build cultural complexity, environmental disaster struck and knocked them back down to baseline survival mode. The innovations that required leisure time, stable food supplies, and large enough populations to support specialists would have been the first casualties of any crisis. This should move us in ways that are hard to articulate. These weren't primitive proto-humans struggling toward consciousness. These were people like us, fully human, capable of abstraction, of art, of innovation, of culture. They were reaching for something. They were building something. They were creating meaning in their lives beyond mere survival. And it slipped away from them. Again and again. Not because they failed, but because the world they lived in was harsh and unforgiving. Because their populations were small and vulnerable. Because the margin between thriving and extinction was razor thin. We are the descendants of the ones who survived those repeated catastrophes. The ones who kept the spark alive through volcanic winters and droughts and population crashes. The ones who, against all odds, maintained just enough cultural knowledge, just enough social complexity, just enough population size to eventually cross the threshold where innovations could spread and persist. But for 50,000 years or more, the outcome was uncertain. The sparks kept dying out. The potential kept failing to manifest. Our ancestors kept reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. Until finally, around 50,000 years ago, something changed. The conditions aligned. The population grew large enough, the social networks became robust enough, the environmental pressures eased just enough. The spark finally caught. The fire began to spread. And once it caught, it never went out again. Picture this. It's 60,000 years ago. You're standing on the African savanna at dusk, watching a small band of humans make camp for the night. They're anatomically modern in every way. Their brains are the same size as yours. Their vocal anatomy is identical. Their hands have the same dexterity. They could walk into a modern city, put on contemporary clothes, and physically blend right in. They're building a fire using techniques passed down through countless generations. They're making stone tools, knapping flakes from cores with practiced efficiency. They're processing food, caring for their young, communicating in a language we'd recognize as language even if we couldn't understand the words. They're human. Fully human. But if you look closely at what they're creating, what they're leaving behind, you notice something striking. There's no art, no jewelry, no musical instruments, no elaborate burials, no long-distance trade. Their tools are functional but relatively simple. Their lives leave almost no mark on the world beyond the immediate necessities of survival. Now picture this. Fast forward just 25,000 years. Not even a blink in evolutionary time. Not nearly long enough for significant biological evolution. You're in a cave in what will one day be southern France, and the walls are covered with paintings, not crude stick figures. Sophisticated, dynamic images of horses and bison and aurochs rendered with perspective and motion and artistic intent. The proportions are accurate. The shading suggests volume. The poses capture the essence of the animals with an economy of line that would impress a modern artist. In a cave in Germany, someone has spent hundreds of hours carving a piece of mammoth ivory into a figure that is part human, part lion. It's not a representation of something that exists. It's imagination made physical. It's mythology. It's art that depicts something that exists only in the mind. People are wearing necklaces made from shells that originated 300 kilometers away. Evidence of trade networks spanning distances that would take weeks to traverse. They're playing music on flutes carved from bird bones, instruments that require an understanding of acoustics and the ability to conceive of creating beauty rather than just utility. They're burying their dead with elaborate grave goods, ochre and beads and tools, suggesting beliefs about an afterlife, about status, about meaning that extends beyond the immediate and material. Something happened. Something fundamental shifted. And it happened fast. This is what archaeologists call the creative explosion, sometimes termed the Great Leap Forward, though that phrase has fallen out of favor because it implies a simplicity that the evidence doesn't support. But whatever we call it, the phenomenon is real. And it's staggering. Within a window of roughly 10,000 to 20,000 years, between about 50,000 and 35,000 years ago, human behavior transformed in ways that had never happened before and would never stop happening again. Here's the thing. This wasn't a gradual accumulation of innovations. This wasn't the steady march of progress we often imagine. This was an explosion, a cascade, a threshold being crossed. And once it was crossed, there was no going back. The oldest known cave paintings aren't in Europe, as was long assumed. They're in Sulawesi, Indonesia, dated to at least 45,500 years ago. Hand stencils and images of local animals, created by people who had the same impulse to leave their mark, to say, I was here, to create something that would outlast them. The fact that these paintings exist on an island in Southeast Asia, while similar paintings appear in Europe and Africa, tells us something crucial. This wasn't one group inventing art and then spreading it through migration. This was something emerging independently in multiple places, as if the capacity had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions to manifest. Think about what that means. The hardware was ready. The software was ready. Something about the circumstances changed. And suddenly everywhere, humans began doing things they'd never done before. In the Swabian Jura of southern Germany, in caves like Hohlefels and Hohensteinstadel, archaeologists have found a treasure trove of artifacts that date to around 40,000 years ago. The Lion Man of Hohensteinstadel is perhaps the most striking. It's a sculpture about 12 inches tall, carved from mammoth ivory, depicting a being that is part human and part lion. The level of craftsmanship is extraordinary. The sculptor had to visualize the final form before beginning, had to understand the properties of ivory, had to have tools capable of detailed work, and had to invest hundreds of hours in the creation of something that had no practical utility whatsoever. This is symbolic thought made tangible. This is imagination. This is the creation of something that represents an idea rather than a thing, and it's 40,000 years old. In the same region, in the Hohlefels cave, archaeologists found bone flutes dating to about 42,000 years ago. These aren't simple whistles. They're sophisticated musical instruments carved from the wing bones of griffin vultures and the ivory of woolly mammoths. They have finger holes carefully positioned to produce specific notes. Someone understood acoustics well enough to create an instrument that could make music. And someone valued music enough to invest the time and skill necessary to create such an instrument. Music serves no immediate survival function. You can't eat it. You can't use it to hunt or defend yourself. But humans 42,000 years ago were making it anyway, because music does something else. It creates social cohesion. It expresses emotion. It makes life worth living, rather than just survivable. And here's where it gets interesting. These innovations aren't isolated. They're part of a package of changes that all appear together, in multiple places, in roughly the same time frame. Long-distance trade networks emerge. By 40,000 years ago, archaeologists find obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, at sites more than 300 kilometers from the nearest source. That's not a casual distance. That's a journey of weeks through difficult terrain. It requires planning, social networks, and systems of exchange. It requires trust between groups that might otherwise be competitors or enemies. It requires the concept of value that extends beyond immediate utility. Elaborate burial practices appear across multiple continents almost simultaneously. In Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, people begin burying their dead with grave goods: ochre for coloring the body, beads and jewelry, tools and weapons, food offerings. These burials tell us something profound about the people who created them. They believed in something beyond the immediate. They had concepts of status and identity that persisted beyond death. They invested resources in ritual rather than survival. Personal adornment becomes widespread. Shell beads, carved pendants, elaborate headdresses. These aren't just decorations. They're social signals. They communicate identity, status, affiliation. They require the cognitive sophistication to understand that symbols can convey meaning, that appearance can be manipulated to create an impression, that there's a social game being played that goes beyond physical dominance. Tool technology becomes dramatically more sophisticated. Blade tools that are lighter and more efficient than earlier flake tools. Composite tools with multiple parts hafted together with adhesives. Specialized tools for specific tasks, rather than general-purpose implements. This represents not just technical skill but forward planning, the ability to conceive of a tool before making it, to understand the properties of different materials and how to combine them for maximum effect. The speed of this transformation is what makes it so difficult to explain. If you plotted human cultural complexity on a graph, you'd see a nearly flat line for 190,000 years. Maybe a few small bumps during the Middle Stone Age, and then suddenly, around 50,000 years ago, the line shoots upward and never comes back down. It's not a gradual curve, it's an explosion, and it's global. That's crucial. This isn't happening in one place, and then spreading slowly through migration and cultural diffusion. It's happening in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, all within a relatively brief window of time. The specific expressions vary by region, different art styles, different tool technologies, different raw materials, but the underlying pattern is the same everywhere. Humans are suddenly doing things they'd never done before. Something triggered a cascade that had been waiting to happen. Compare that to the previous 190,000 years. During the Middle Stone Age, we see occasional glimpses of behavioral modernity. The engraved ochre at Blombos Cave, the heat-treated tools at Pinnacle Point, shell beads at a handful of sites. But these innovations don't spread. They don't persist. They appear and then disappear, like sparks that fail to catch. For nearly 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived without creating the kind of material culture that would characterize all subsequent human societies. And then, in what is essentially an instant in evolutionary terms, everything changes. The sparks catch. The fire spreads. And it never goes out again. The archaeological record from this period is almost overwhelming in its richness. Cave paintings at Chauvet in France, dated to around 37,000 years ago, display such sophisticated technique that when they were first discovered, many experts believed they must be more recent. The artists understood perspective, used shading to create three-dimensional effects, depicted motion and behavior with remarkable accuracy. These aren't the first tentative efforts of people learning to make art. These are the works of people who already have a mature artistic tradition. Venus figurines begin appearing across Europe, small carved figures, usually female, with exaggerated sexual characteristics. They're found from France to Siberia, suggesting either widespread cultural exchange or independent invention of similar symbolic forms. They're dated to between 35,000 and 25,000 years ago. Whatever they meant to the people who made them, fertility symbols, ancestor representations, religious icons, they represent a level of symbolic thought that requires the ability to create meaning that extends beyond the literal. Burial practices become increasingly elaborate. At Sungir in Russia, a burial site dated to around 34,000 years ago contained 2 children buried head to head, their bodies covered with thousands of ivory beads that would have taken someone thousands of hours to create. The investment of resources in this burial is staggering. It tells us that these people valued something beyond immediate survival, that they had concepts of status and ritual that were worth enormous expenditures of time and effort. The transformation isn't just about new technologies or new art forms. It's about a fundamental shift in how humans related to the world and to each other. It's about the emergence of culture as we understand it, systems of meaning that are shared, transmitted, and elaborated across generations. Think about what had to be in place for this to happen. You need language sophisticated enough to transmit complex ideas. You need social structures stable enough to preserve and build on innovations. You need populations large enough that individual genius can be recognized and transmitted rather than lost when that individual dies. You need enough surplus resources that some people can specialize in activities that don't directly contribute to survival. You need networks of exchange that allow ideas and technologies to spread beyond individual groups. All of these things had to come together. And around 50,000 years ago, they did. The mystery isn't just that it happened. The mystery is why it took so long. Why did anatomically modern humans exist for 190,000 years before this transformation occurred? What was missing? What changed? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. We have theories, and we'll explore them soon, but the evidence is ambiguous and the debate continues. What we do know is that once the transformation began, it was irreversible. There's no going back. No population that crossed this threshold ever reverted to the simpler behavioral patterns of earlier periods. This should fill us with wonder. Our ancestors, people with brains identical to ours, lived for millennia in a kind of cultural stasis that we can barely imagine. And then something unlocked. The potential that had been there all along finally manifested. The capacity for symbolic thought, for art, for music, for elaborate social structures, for technological innovation, all of it erupted into the world in what is, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. We are the inheritors of that explosion. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece of music, every technological innovation, every social institution, all of it traces back to that moment when something fundamental shifted in how humans related to the world. The caves of Lascaux and Altamira and Chauvet aren't just archaeological sites. They're cathedrals. They're evidence of people who looked at the world and saw not just resources to exploit, but beauty to capture, meaning to create, stories to tell. They're evidence of people who were, in every way that matters, us, and that's what makes this period so moving. For the first time in the archaeological record, we can look at what our ancestors created and recognize ourselves. We can stand in front of a 40,000-year-old cave painting and feel what the artist felt. We can hold a carved figurine and understand the impulse that created it. We can imagine the sound of a bone flute echoing through a cave and know that music moved them the way it moves us. The creative explosion wasn't just a change in behavior, it was an awakening. It was the moment when human potential, which had been latent for so long, finally found expression. It was the moment when we became, fully and irrevocably ourselves. But this raises the deepest question of all. What caused this transformation? Why then? Why not 100,000 years earlier or 50,000 years later? What changed in the human condition that allowed this explosion to occur? Scientists have proposed theories ranging from genetic mutations to climate change to population dynamics to something far stranger. Each theory has evidence supporting it. Each has problems, and the truth is probably some combination of factors that we haven't yet fully untangled. What we're about to explore are the attempts to explain the inexplicable, to understand how and why beings who were already human finally began acting in ways that we recognize as fully human. The theories are as fascinating as the event itself, and they tell us as much about our present as they do about our past. So what caused it? What broke the silence? Here's the thing. We have the evidence. We can see the transformation in the archaeological record as clearly as we can see layers of sediment in a cliff face. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, human behavior changed fundamentally and irreversibly. The artifacts tell us that. The cave paintings tell us that. The sudden spread of humans across the globe tells us that. But when we ask why, when we try to identify the specific cause or causes, the picture becomes frustratingly unclear. Not because scientists haven't thought about it. They've thought about it extensively. Not because there aren't theories. There are several, each backed by serious researchers and substantial evidence. The problem is that none of them fully explains what happened. Each theory illuminates part of the mystery while leaving other parts in shadow. Each has evidence supporting it and evidence that doesn't quite fit. And the more we learn, the more complex the picture becomes. Picture the scientific community over the past few decades wrestling with this question. Geneticists examining ancient DNA, anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, archaeologists cataloging tens of thousands of artifacts, linguists modeling the development of language, climate scientists reconstructing ancient weather patterns, each discipline bringing its own tools, its own perspective, its own answers. And yet the mystery remains. Let's start with what might seem like the most obvious explanation. The neural mutation hypothesis. It goes something like this. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, a genetic change occurred in the human brain that enabled full modern language capacity. This mutation spread through the population, and suddenly humans could communicate complex, abstract ideas. With that new linguistic ability came everything else. Art, music, sophisticated technology, complex social structures. Language was the key that unlocked human potential. It's an elegant theory. It explains the suddenness of the change. A mutation happens, it spreads, behavior transforms. Clean, simple, satisfying. And there's even a candidate gene, FOXP2. This gene is involved in the development of the neural circuits necessary for speech and language. We know this because people with mutations in FOXP2 have severe difficulties with language production and comprehension. We also know that the human version of FOXP2 is different from the version found in other primates, and that these differences affect how the gene functions in the brain. Here's where it gets interesting. When researchers examined the FOXP2 gene across human populations, they found evidence of strong positive selection. Meaning, at some point in our evolutionary history, a particular variant of this gene became so advantageous that it spread rapidly through the human population. Natural selection strongly favored individuals who had this variant. The evidence suggests this selection occurred around 200,000 years ago. Maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later. The genetic dating isn't precise enough to pin it down exactly. Think about that for a moment. 200,000 years ago, not 50,000 years ago, when the creative explosion happened, not even close. The mutation that supposedly enabled modern language capacity occurred 150,000 years before humans started behaving in ways that suggest they had modern language capacity. That's a problem, a significant problem. If FOXP2 gave us language, and language gave us modern behavior, why did it take so long for the behavior to appear? Some researchers have suggested that maybe FOXP2 wasn't enough by itself. Maybe other genetic changes were necessary. Changes we haven't identified yet. Maybe there was a second mutation, or a third. that occurred closer to 50,000 years ago and completed the package. But here's what's really troubling about that argument. We've sequenced DNA from Neanderthals. We've sequenced DNA from Denisovans. Both of these archaic human species had the same version of FOXP2 that we have. The modern human version, they had it before we split from them, which means they had it for hundreds of thousands of years. And yet Neanderthals, despite having modern FOXP2, never developed the kind of elaborate symbolic culture that anatomically modern humans developed after 50,000 years ago. They made tools, yes, sophisticated tools. They buried their dead, suggesting some form of symbolic thought. But they didn't paint caves, they didn't carve figurines, they didn't make musical instruments, not in the way or on the scale that modern humans did after the creative explosion. So FOXP2 can't be the whole answer. It might be part of the answer, but it's not sufficient to explain the transformation. The evidence suggests, but does not prove, that language capacity was in place long before the creative explosion, which means we need to look elsewhere for the trigger. This brings us to the population density hypothesis. This theory approaches the problem from a completely different angle. It says, forget genetics, forget mutations. The key isn't what changed inside human brains. The key is how many humans there were and how they were distributed across the landscape. The argument goes like this. Cultural innovation isn't primarily about individual genius, it's about cumulative culture. Ideas building on ideas, technologies building on technologies. But for cumulative culture to work, you need enough people in contact with each other to maintain and transmit innovations. You need what researchers call a critical mass. In small, isolated populations, innovations are fragile. They can be lost through chance. A skilled toolmaker dies before fully teaching their technique to the next generation. A group migrates away from the raw materials necessary for a particular technology. A bad hunting season forces people to focus entirely on immediate survival, and more complex cultural practices get abandoned. But when populations grow larger and denser, when groups are in more frequent contact with each other, innovations become more stable. More people know the technique. More people can pass it on. Ideas can spread between groups. Technologies can be refined through the contributions of many individuals across many generations. The population density hypothesis suggests that around 50,000 years ago, human populations reached a threshold. Estimates vary, but some researchers suggest the global human population may have reached around 1 million individuals by this time. Not all in one place, obviously, spread across Africa and increasingly beyond. But 1 million people means more groups, more interactions, more opportunities for ideas to spread and build on each other. It's the network effect, essentially. The value of a network increases exponentially as the number of nodes increases. With more people connected to each other, even loosely, the potential for cultural innovation multiplies. There's something compelling about this theory. It doesn't require any genetic changes. It doesn't require any mysterious mutations. It just requires enough people in enough contact with each other to sustain cumulative culture. Once you cross that threshold, the explosion becomes almost inevitable. And there's evidence supporting it. Studies of modern human societies show clear correlations between population size and cultural complexity. Larger populations maintain more diverse toolkits. They have more specialized knowledge. They can support more elaborate social structures. Researchers have even created computer models simulating cultural evolution in populations of different sizes. The models consistently show that below certain population thresholds, innovations are unstable and frequently lost. Above those thresholds, innovations accumulate and build on each other. But here's the problem. We don't actually know what the human population was 50,000 years ago. The figure of 1 million is an educated guess based on genetic diversity and archaeological evidence, but it's not certain. It could have been half that. It could have been twice that. The margin of error is enormous. More troubling, we have evidence of sophisticated behaviors appearing in small, isolated populations. The ochre engravings at Blombos Cave created 75,000 years ago. The heat-treated tools at Pinnacle Point created 164,000 years ago. These weren't made by large, densely connected populations. They were made by small groups, probably numbering in the dozens or at most a few hundred individuals. So small populations can innovate. They can create complex technologies and symbolic artifacts. What they apparently can't do reliably is maintain those innovations across long periods of time. The population density hypothesis might explain why innovations persisted after 50,000 years ago when they hadn't persisted before. But it doesn't fully explain why the innovations themselves became more frequent and more elaborate. Now let's talk about climate. The climate pressure hypothesis suggests that environmental stress forced innovation. When conditions are stable and resources are abundant, there's no pressure to change. Why develop new technologies when the old ones work fine? Why take risks when the current strategy ensures survival? But when the climate shifts, when resources become scarce, when survival becomes difficult, innovation becomes necessary. Environmental pressure forces populations to adapt or die. And adaptation, in humans, means cultural innovation. The timing fits. The last ice age intensified around 70,000 years ago. Global temperatures dropped. Ice sheets expanded across the northern continents. Climate became more variable and unpredictable. Africa, where most humans still lived, experienced repeated cycles of drought and rainfall. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose and fell. Ecosystems transformed. For humans living through these changes, life would have become harder. Traditional food sources might have disappeared. Familiar territories might have become uninhabitable. Groups would have been forced to adapt, to innovate, to find new ways of surviving in a changing world. And perhaps that pressure, sustained over thousands of years, drove the creative explosion. Perhaps necessity really was the mother of invention. Perhaps humans developed new technologies, new social structures, new ways of thinking because they had to. There's evidence for this. The archaeological record shows that some of the most significant innovations appeared during periods of environmental stress. The development of more sophisticated hunting technologies, the expansion into new environments, the elaboration of social networks that allowed groups to share resources during hard times. But here's what doesn't fit. Environmental stress has been constant throughout human evolution. Climate has always been variable. Ice ages have come and gone multiple times over the past million years. Our ancestors faced environmental challenges long before 50,000 years ago. The Toba supereruption 74,000 years ago created environmental stress on a scale that dwarfs anything that happened during the later intensification of the Ice Age. If environmental pressure drives innovation, why didn't the creative explosion happen then? Why did it take another 20,000 years or more? And there's something else. Environmental stress often reduces cultural complexity rather than increasing it. When survival becomes difficult, populations focus on immediate needs. Elaborate cultural practices get abandoned. Specialized knowledge gets lost. Groups fragment and isolate themselves, rather than maintaining the social networks necessary for cultural transmission. So while climate pressure might have played a role, it can't be the complete explanation. Something else was necessary. This brings us to what might be the most interesting theory of all, the network effect hypothesis. This theory combines elements of the population density hypothesis with insights about how information spreads and builds. The idea is this. What changed around 50,000 years ago wasn't population size per se, but population connectivity. Groups that had been isolated began to come into more frequent contact. Ideas began to spread between populations. Technologies began to be shared and refined through the contributions of many different groups. And here's where genetics provides fascinating evidence. Studies of ancient and modern DNA suggest that around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, multiple human populations that had been separated for thousands of years began to mix. Anatomically modern humans spreading out of Africa encountered and interbred with Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East. They encountered and interbred with Denisovans in Asia. Different populations of modern humans that had been isolated from each other came back into contact. This mixing wasn't just genetic, it was cultural. When groups with different technologies, different knowledge, different ways of solving problems came into contact, they could share and combine their innovations. The best ideas from each group could spread to others. Technologies could be refined through the insights of people with different perspectives and experiences. Think about what happens when you connect previously isolated networks. The effect isn't additive, it's multiplicative. Each connection creates new possibilities. Each exchange of ideas creates potential for new innovations that neither group could have developed alone. And there's something else. Humans are unique among animals in our capacity for cumulative culture. Other species can learn from each other. Other species have cultural traditions. But only humans build elaborate technologies and social structures that require the accumulated knowledge of many generations to create and maintain. But here's what's fascinating about cumulative culture. Children can learn language spontaneously. Put a group of children together, even without adult language models, and they'll develop a language. It's happened multiple times in documented history. Language emerges naturally from human social interaction. But technology doesn't work that way. Children cannot independently reinvent complex technologies. They can't figure out how to make a bow and arrow from scratch. They can't discover metallurgy or agriculture or writing through individual insight alone. These things require transmission. They require learning from others who already know. They require cultural inheritance. This suggests something important. The creative explosion wasn't just about individual humans becoming smarter or more capable. It was about the development of social structures and networks that could reliably transmit complex knowledge across generations and across space. It was about creating the conditions where cumulative culture could flourish. When populations are small and isolated, cultural transmission is fragile. When populations grow and connect, cultural transmission becomes robust. And once cultural transmission becomes robust enough, cumulative culture takes off. Innovation builds on innovation. Knowledge accumulates. The ratchet effect kicks in, where each generation starts from a higher baseline than the previous one. The network effect hypothesis suggests that around 50,000 years ago, human populations reached a threshold of connectivity where cumulative culture became self-sustaining. Once that happened, the creative explosion was inevitable. But we simply do not know if this is the complete answer. We don't know exactly how connected different populations were. We don't know how frequently they interacted. We don't know how ideas spread between groups, or how quickly innovations diffused across landscapes. And here's the deepest problem with all of these theories. They might all be right. The truth might be that multiple factors came together around 50,000 years ago. Population growth, climate pressure, increased connectivity between groups, perhaps genetic changes we haven't identified yet, perhaps the development of more sophisticated language, perhaps new social structures that made cultural transmission more reliable. Perhaps all of these things had to align before the threshold could be crossed. Perhaps it was a convergence of factors rather than a single cause. Perhaps that's why it took so long. All the pieces had to be in place before the transformation could occur. Or perhaps we're missing something fundamental. Perhaps there's a factor we haven't considered, an explanation we haven't imagined, evidence we haven't found yet. The mystery remains open. And that's okay. That's part of what makes us human. The capacity to ask questions we can't yet answer. The ability to look at our own past and wonder how we became what we are. The humility to admit that some things remain unknown. What we do know is this. Something changed. The archaeological record is clear about that. Human behavior transformed around 50,000 years ago in ways that were unprecedented and irreversible. The potential that had been latent for so long finally manifested. The capacity for art, for music, for elaborate technology, for complex social structures erupted into the world. And once it happened, it never stopped. The creative explosion that began 50,000 years ago continues today. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece of music, every technological innovation we create is part of that same unbroken tradition that began when our ancestors first painted caves and carved figurines and made music from bone flutes. We are the inheritors of that transformation. We live in the world it created. And the fact that we still don't fully understand how or why it happened should fill us with wonder rather than frustration. The time gap in human prehistory, that long silence between the emergence of anatomically modern humans and the appearance of modern human behavior, remains one of the deepest mysteries in our understanding of ourselves. We have theories, we have evidence, we have sophisticated models and careful analysis. But the complete answer eludes us. And perhaps it always will. Perhaps some aspects of our own origins will remain forever unknowable, lost in the depths of time, preserved only in artifacts that hint at stories we can never fully read. But the time gaps don't end with prehistory. Throughout human history, we find similar patterns of stasis and sudden transformation. Periods where civilizations seem frozen in time, followed by explosions of innovation and change. The pattern repeats, again and again, across different times and places. Picture this. It is the Late Bronze Age, around 1230 BCE. The world from the Aegean Sea to the Nile Delta, from the Anatolian Plateau to the sun-baked coast of Canaan, is humming with life and connection. Cities rise from the earth: Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, Thebes, each a node in a dazzling network that stretches for hundreds, even thousands of miles. The Mediterranean is not a barrier, but a highway. Ships with tall prows and painted eyes ply its blue surface, their holds heavy with tin from as far as Cornwall, copper from Cyprus, wine from Crete, ivory from Africa, silver from Spain, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan. Imagine the docks at Ugarit on a busy afternoon. The air is thick with shouted bargains in many languages: Akkadian, Hittite, Egyptian, Luwian, Greek, Hurrian. Scribes dip their reeds and inscribe cuneiform tablets on damp clay, trade contracts, diplomatic letters, receipts for grain or timber or purple cloth. In the palace, a royal secretary carefully stores a letter from the Egyptian pharaoh diplomatic gift, written in a script that will be deciphered thousands of years later by scholars who can scarcely believe the complexity of these ancient alliances. Picture the walls of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, ringed with lions carved from stone. Inside, the king's court is a whirl of ritual and bureaucracy, priests and diplomats, foreign envoys and captured enemies. The library of Hattusa holds thousands of tablets, some listing treaties with distant kingdoms, others recording omens, inventories, and prayers. Across the sea, in Mycenaean Greece, palaces at Pylos and Tiryns pulse with administrative activity. Every shipment of oil, every herd of cattle, every consignment of bronze is recorded in Linear B, a script deciphered only in the 20th century. This is a world of monumental architecture, ziggurats and temples, citadels and city walls. A world where writing is not just a technology, but a glue that binds together economies, religions, and states. Literacy, once the preserve of priests, has become a tool of merchants and administrators. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom rule over a domain that stretches from the Sudanese deserts to the edge of Syria. Their scribes keep records on papyrus, their artisans paint tombs with scenes of gods and harvests and military triumphs. It is a world that feels permanent, stable, predictable. Each year, the Nile floods, the crops are sown, the ships arrive, the markets open, each city knows its place in the web, each kingdom trusts in its gods and its treaties. There are wars, of course, there are always wars, but the system bends and recovers. For centuries this order has endured, and then silence. Within the space of just 2 or 3 human lifetimes, between about 1200 and 1150 BCE, almost everything collapses. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece are burned and abandoned. The great city of Hattusa is destroyed, its libraries smashed, its people scattered. Ugarit, once a cosmopolitan port, falls to invading forces and is never rebuilt. The Egyptian New Kingdom, stretched thin by war and drought, staggers through crisis after crisis. Even mighty Egypt, which will survive in name, is permanently diminished. The old order dissolves. Within 50 years, nearly every major Bronze Age civilization in the eastern Mediterranean is either gone or reduced to a shadow of its former self. Populations plummet. Cities are abandoned. Literacy, once the mark of civilization, vanishes from entire regions. Trade routes that had survived for centuries are broken, perhaps forever. This is the Bronze Age collapse. It is a rupture so sweeping, so profound, that for centuries afterward, the survivors looked back on this time as a lost age of heroes and gods, a golden era, now irretrievable. What caused it? The honest answer is that we simply do not know. But let's not rush past the details. Here's what makes this period so haunting. The evidence is everywhere, if you know where to look. At the citadel of Mycenae in Greece, the Great Lion Gate still stands, but the palace behind it was burned and never rebuilt. The Linear B tablets found there administrative records, inventories, lists of goods and people, end abruptly. In fact, after the collapse, the knowledge of writing itself is lost. For nearly 4 centuries, Greeks forget how to write. From about 1200 BCE to 800 BCE, there are no inscriptions, no records, no written contracts or stories. The Linear B script, used for centuries, simply disappears. Greece becomes, in a sense, silent. Think about what that means. For 400 years, an entire people lose the thread of written history. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the great epics of Greece, are composed and passed down orally, not written down until writing returns centuries later. The population of Greece itself may have dropped by 75%. Archaeologists estimate that where there were once hundreds of settlements and small towns, only a fraction remain occupied after the collapse. Entire regions, once thick with farms and villages, become empty. Across the Aegean, the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, vanishes almost overnight. Hattusa is destroyed, its stones left to tumble in the Anatolian wind. The empire's archives, thousands of clay tablets, are buried and forgotten until rediscovered in the 20th century. No written records survive from the people who lived through its end. In the Levant, Ugarit is destroyed and abandoned. Archaeologists found tablets in its ruins, some still unfired, recording desperate pleas for help. The enemy's ships are already here. Our cities are burning. The letters were never answered. The city was never rebuilt. In Egypt, the pharaoh Ramesses III fights off a wave of invasions by mysterious enemies he calls the Sea Peoples. The battles are commemorated in reliefs at Medinet Habu: chariots, ships, arrows flying across stone. Egypt survives, but only just. The power and reach of the new kingdom is broken. Egypt is never again the superpower it once was. Who were these Sea Peoples? The honest answer is that we do not know. Egyptian records depict them as confederations of foreign tribes, Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Danayan, but their origins remain debated. Some researchers suggest they came from the Aegean, displaced by famine or war. Others see them as mercenaries or migrants from Anatolia or even Italy. Perhaps they were a symptom, not a cause, one wave among many in a region in turmoil. But here's what's really fascinating. The collapse is not just about armies and invaders. It is about the unraveling of a system, a complex, interdependent network of trade, diplomacy, and technology. The Bronze Age world was interconnected in ways that rival our own. Tin from distant lands was needed to make bronze. If trade faltered, so did the tools and weapons that kept societies running. When one node failed, the consequences rippled outward. Imagine what it must have felt like. You are a scribe in Ugarit, recording shipments of grain waiting for the next ship from Cyprus with copper, or the next caravan with horses from the steppe. And then, the ships stop coming. The markets are empty. The fields outside the city are burned or abandoned. The king's messengers ride out and do not return. Letters are sent, but no reply comes. And then silence. It is tempting to look for a single cause, a villain, a disaster, a war. But the evidence resists easy answers. Some researchers argue for environmental catastrophe. The tree rings of ancient oaks and cedars show years of drought and failed harvests around 1200 BCE. Famine is recorded in the tablets. There is no grain in our land. Others point to earthquakes. Fault lines run through the eastern Mediterranean, and layer upon layer of destruction in cities like Troy and Mycenae could be the result of seismic catastrophe. Still others believe the system itself became too complex, too fragile. As economies grew more interdependent and populations swelled, a shock in one area, whether drought, war, or migration, could trigger cascading failures elsewhere. This is called systems collapse. And it may be the most unsettling theory of all, because it suggests that success itself plants the seeds of disaster. Of course, war and invasion played a role. The archaeological record is littered with burnt layers, smashed pottery, arrowheads embedded in walls. The Sea Peoples are attested in Egyptian records, but whether they were conquerors, refugees, or both remains unclear. Perhaps famine and drought drove populations to the sea, setting off waves of migration and conflict. Perhaps local elites, unable to feed their people or pay their armies, lost control. Perhaps multiple factors converged, a perfect storm of crisis. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. There are drought records and destruction layers, refugee camps and mass graves, desperate letters and broken shrines. But no single cause quite explains the scale and speed of the collapse. What we do know is this: the international trade networks that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia to Greece, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, completely broke down. No more copper from Cyprus, no more tin from the east, no more luxury goods from distant lands. Palaces that had depended on these flows to fund armies and temples and feasts suddenly found themselves isolated, unable to pay workers or feed cities. The old ways became impossible, and with the loss of trade, writing itself withered. In Mycenaean Greece, the linear B script simply disappears. For 4 centuries, there is no evidence of writing at all. In Anatolia, the Hittite cuneiform vanishes, lost to memory for over 3,000 years. In the Levant, the intricate Ugaritic alphabet is forgotten. What had been written, recorded, counted, and remembered is now lost. The silence is so profound that archaeologists call the aftermath the Greek Dark Ages. For 300 to 400 years, the evidence is minimal. Pottery becomes plain and crude. Settlements shrink to tiny hamlets, sometimes just a few families living among the ruins of their ancestors' cities. Graves are poorer, with few grave goods. The monumental architecture of the Bronze Age is gone. In its place, small huts and simple tools. It is as if civilization itself has retreated, as if history has been erased. And yet, the people endure. For centuries, the descendants of the Bronze Age survivors live in smaller communities, farming and herding, telling stories of lost palaces and vanished heroes. In Greece, the tales of the Trojan War and the wanderings of Odysseus are sung by bards, not written down until centuries later. The memory of writing is gone, but the memory of greatness lingers. Compare that to the earlier prehistoric gap we explored. There, too, a vast silence. A period when anatomically modern humans existed, but left almost no trace of advancement. Now, in the Bronze Age collapse, the pattern repeats on a different scale. Here are people with cities, scripts, diplomacy, and international trade. And yet, within a lifetime, so much is lost that the survivors live in the shadow of a greatness they can no longer even record. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so haunting. It is not just the loss of things, palaces, statues, ships. It is the loss of memory, the loss of identity. When writing disappears, so does the ability to remember. The stories of kings and victories and treaties fade. The knowledge of how to build great walls, how to cast bronze, how to write in cuneiform or linear bay. These are not just skills but lifelines to the past. For centuries, the survivors of the collapse lived in a world where the past was a rumor, a legend. They built smaller, simpler things. They wrote nothing down. They remembered only in song and story. And then, slowly, recovery began. Around 800 BCE, Greeks borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenicians and began to write again. The first inscriptions appear, names scratched on pottery, short dedications on stone. The Iliad and the Odyssey are finally written down. Cities grow. Trade resumes. But the world that emerges is not the same as the one that was lost. Think about that for a moment. Progress is not inevitable. Civilization can, and sometimes does, retreat. Knowledge can be lost, not just for a generation, but for centuries. The silence that follows a collapse can endure longer than living memory, longer than monuments, longer than the stories themselves. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. In 1200 BCE, a trader in Ugarit could send a letter to the pharaoh in Egypt and expect a reply within weeks. By 1100 BCE, that world is gone. A farmer in Greece might never travel more than a day's walk from home, might never see a ship, might never hear a foreign language. The interconnected world, the first true international system, had dissolved into fragments. We see the pattern. An age of complexity, interconnection, and apparent stability, followed by a rupture so deep that even the memory of that age vanishes. And then, silence. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse remain debated. Was it war, famine, migration, earthquake, or all of these at once? The answer is complicated. The evidence points in every direction, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. We simply do not know for certain, and that is what makes it so compelling. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes. The world we live in today is, in many ways, just as interconnected, just as dependent on fragile systems, just as confident in its own permanence. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is not that disaster is inevitable, but that resilience is not guaranteed. What is built can be lost. And yet, even in the darkness, the seeds of recovery are planted. The Greek alphabet, the rise of new city-states, the eventual flowering of philosophy and science, these are not continuations, but rebirths. What was lost is not always regained, but something new can emerge from the silence. So, as you drift further into the night, let the weight of lost civilizations settle gently. Think of the ships that no longer sailed, the scripts that no one could read, the stories that faded with the last bard who remembered them. Think of the time gap, not just as a tragedy, but as a mystery, a testament to the fragility of memory, the resilience of people, and the strange, uneven path of human history. The Bronze Age collapse is a historical echo of the prehistoric pattern, a sudden, mysterious gap when even advanced civilizations seemed to forget themselves, and time moved backward before it could move forward again. The pattern repeats. And this brings us to something even more fascinating. The gaps and silences of history are not confined to prehistory or the distant ancient world. The pattern of mysterious gaps continues into more recent history, in places we might not expect. Picture this. You are standing beneath the vast, silent dome of the Pantheon in Rome. It is early morning, and the city outside is just beginning to stir, but inside these ancient walls, time feels suspended. You tilt your head back and gaze upward. Above you soars a perfect hemisphere of concrete, unreinforced, smooth, weightless, and yet impossibly massive, spanning 43.3 meters across. The oculus, a circular opening 9 meters wide, pours down a shaft of pale light, illuminating the shadowed recesses below. For nearly 1,900 years, no one would match this feat. Not in stone, not in brick, not in concrete. Not until 1881, when the hull of the Paris Stock Exchange was built, did another dome of similar scale finally emerge. Think about that for a moment. How could knowledge so profound, so practical and visible, something you could stand underneath, simply disappear? How could the secret of Roman concrete, opus cementitium, be lost to time, and with it, a whole way of building that once shaped the world? This is not an isolated story. It's a pattern. Human beings discover, invent, and refine, and then, sometimes silently, sometimes with a crash, what was known is forgotten. Technologies, methods, even ideas vanish, sometimes for centuries. Not because of intellectual failure, but because the chain of transmission, so fragile, snapped. Let's linger here in the Pantheon's cool shadows a little longer. The Romans did not just pour concrete. They created a material that endures. The secret was volcanic ash, pulvis puteolanus, quarried near the Bay of Naples. When mixed with lime and water, it formed a chemical bond so strong that, submerged in seawater, it actually grew harder over time. Roman harbors still survive along the Mediterranean, their concrete piers and breakwaters stubbornly resisting the waves after nearly 2 millennia. Modern concrete, in contrast, crumbles and decays in decades when exposed to salt water. Archaeologists and engineers have puzzled over this resilience. Only in the 21st century did materials scientists begin to unlock the precise chemistry. The Romans understood, empirically if not theoretically, how to harness the minerals in volcanic ash to create a self-healing, crystalline matrix. Their concrete was alive, in a sense. It repaired itself. But here's where the story turns. Somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of industrial Europe, the recipe was forgotten. Medieval builders had access to lime and stone, but the secret of volcanic ash, the perfect proportions, the methods of mixing, the slow curing vanished from the record. Cathedrals soared in stone, but concrete of Roman quality was absent from the landscape. European builders would not rediscover the technique until the 19th century, when scientists and masons, working from ancient ruins and scattered texts, finally pieced together the lost formula. Why did this happen? Why does knowledge slip through our fingers so easily? The answer is as much about the fragility of memory as it is about the march of progress. Knowledge is preserved not just in books, but in practices, apprenticeship, unbroken lines of teaching and doing. When those lines are cut by war, by plague, by economic collapse, or simple neglect, what once was obvious becomes obscure. The Pantheon's dome stands as a silent rebuke to the idea that progress is inevitable. Sometimes we go backwards. Here's the thing. The loss of Roman concrete is just one thread in a larger tapestry of forgotten knowledge. Across the medieval world, technologies that once seemed permanent dissolved into obscurity. Consider the roads beneath your feet. At its height, the Roma maintained over 400,000 kilometers of roads, engineered with layered stone, gravel, and drainage systems so effective that many are still visible today. The Via Appia, stretching more than 500 kilometers from Rome to Brindisi, was built to last. Roman surveyors aligned roads with uncanny precision. Milestones marked every mile. After the empire fell, the art of road building faded. In medieval Europe, travelers and merchants trudged through muddy, rutted tracks, often impassable in winter. Trade slowed. Communication faltered. The immense infrastructure that once connected the continent fractured into regional isolation. For centuries, no one would replicate the scale or durability of Roman roads. Think about what that means. Whole economies grew more local, more constrained by the seasons and the whims of weather. The arteries of an interconnected world had collapsed, replaced by footpaths and cart trails. The loss was not just material, but social. An entire way of moving through the world narrowed and diminished. And then there's the matter of fire. Not just any fire, but Greek fire, the legendary weapon of the Byzantine navy. Imagine yourself on the deck of a wooden ship, somewhere in the Aegean, as dusk settles and the enemy draws near. Suddenly, a jet of liquid flame arcs across the water, igniting everything it touches. No amount of water can quench it. Panic spreads. The defenders win the day, not through numbers, but through a secret weapon whose recipe was guarded so jealously that it died with its keepers. The composition of Greek fire remains unknown to this day. Some believe it was a form of petroleum, perhaps mixed with quicklime or sulfur. Others propose more exotic formulas: resin, naphtha, saltpeter, pine resin, or combinations thereof. The Byzantine Empire kept the secret so well that, after its fall in 1453, the knowledge vanished completely, lost to time. For centuries, military engineers tried and failed to recreate its effects. No one succeeded. Greek fire became a legend, a ghostly reminder of what secrecy can cost. The technology that once defended an empire was erased, not by conquest, but by the silence of its own protectors. Let's turn now to another relic, one that lay hidden beneath the sea for almost 2,000 years. In 1901, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera found a corroded lump of bronze and wood among the wreckage of an ancient ship. At first, it seemed unremarkable, but as the fragments were cleaned and studied, something astonishing emerged. The Antikythera mechanism, dated to around 100 BCE, is an astronomical calculator of staggering sophistication. More than 30 bronze gears mesh in a compact case, tracking the cycles of the sun, the phases of the moon, the positions of the 5 known planets. It could predict eclipses and model complex astronomical phenomena. The arrangement of the teeth, the precision of the gears, the mathematical insight required, these were all far ahead of their time. For over 1,400 years, no artifact of comparable complexity would appear in the historical record. Medieval clockmakers, working in the 14th century, began to approach this level of mechanical ingenuity, but the knowledge embedded in the Antikythera mechanism was gone. The skill to make such devices had vanished, scattered with the ship that carried it and the world that conceived it. How does this happen? How can something so advanced simply dissolve from view? Here's what's really haunting. The mechanism was not unique. Ancient texts mention similar devices built by engineers like Archimedes and Hipparchus, yet none survived. The line of transmission broke. The last engineers who understood such work died, their notes lost or destroyed, their tools rusted away. The world moved on, a little less capable, a little less connected to its own past. This is not just a story of machines, it is a story of bodies, of healing and suffering. In the 2nd century CE, Galen of Pergamon wrote extensively about anatomy and surgery. His texts described procedures for cataract removal, for trepanning the skull, for setting complex fractures. Roman and Greek physicians practiced techniques that would not be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, so too did its medical schools. Much of Galen's work survived in Arabic translation, but in Western Europe, surgery retreated to the realm of barbers and bone setters. Sterile technique, anatomical dissection, even the knowledge of how to tie arteries was forgotten. Patients suffered for generations. Only during the Renaissance, as scholars rediscovered ancient texts and began to experiment anew, did these skills return. The loss was not absolute. Some knowledge filtered through monasteries, some through folk tradition. But the overall decline was profound. Generations lived and died with less understanding of their own bodies than people centuries before. And what about water? In Roman cities, water flowed freely. Aqueducts brought clear streams from distant hills, some spanning more than 50 kilometers, to fountains, baths, and private homes. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, channeled waste away from the city center. Public toilets, baths, and piped water became hallmarks of urban life. After Rome's fall, these systems crumbled. Medieval cities grew dense and fetid. Waste accumulated in streets and rivers. Disease spread. Not until the 1800s did European cities begin to match the sanitation standards of ancient Rome. For more than 1,500 years, the health and comfort of millions declined, not through ignorance, but through the slow unraveling of communal infrastructure. Think about that. For over a millennium, the technology to keep cities clean and healthy was right there in the stones and ruins, visible to anyone who cared to look. Yet the knowledge of how to build and maintain such systems was lost. Generations suffered because the chain of transmission had been broken. We are left with a puzzle. It is tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance, but that is not fair or accurate. The scholars of medieval Europe were not foolish or lazy. They worked with what they had. What was lost was not the capacity to learn, but the scaffolding of knowledge itself, the networks, the languages, the social systems that allowed complex skills to be passed from one generation to the next. Some researchers argue that the collapse of centralized authority made it impossible to marshal the resources needed for large projects. Others point to the loss of trade routes, the decline of urban populations, or the changing priorities of faith and society. Still others suggest that what was lost was not just information, but the confidence to attempt the extraordinary. The answer is complicated. It is not a single event, but a slow, uneven process. In some cases, knowledge was hidden in plain sight, embedded in ruins that people could not read. In others, it was simply erased, the last practitioner dying without an apprentice, the last library burning in a forgotten war. Lost to time. Yet, there are glimmers of continuity. In the monasteries of Ireland, in the libraries of Byzantium, in the bustling cities of the Islamic world, fragments of classical learning survived. Sometimes these fragments made their way back to the West, carried by traders, scholars, or refugees. The Renaissance was in many ways an age of rediscovery, built on the foundations of what had almost been forgotten. But think about the cost. For every text that survived, how many were lost? For every technique that was recovered, how many faded beyond recall? The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, lists more than 13,000 settlements in England. But for most, we know almost nothing of their daily life, their tools, their stories. The silence of the past is not just an absence, it is a presence, a weight felt in every gap, every unanswered question. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. Progress is not a straight line. It is a fragile braid, easily unraveled. What is known today can be unknown tomorrow. We see this most starkly in the fate of Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire held the secret for centuries, using it to defend Constantinople against sieges that would have otherwise succeeded. The recipe was guarded with the utmost care, passed only to trusted engineers and imperial officials. And then, with the empire's fall, the secret slipped away. Modern chemists have tried to reconstruct it, using everything from petroleum distillates to phosphorus compounds, but none have matched the original's terrifying properties. The knowledge was not defeated, it was abandoned, lost to time. The same is true for the Antikythera mechanism. The Greeks understood celestial cycles with a precision that would not be matched until the Renaissance, and even then, only with the aid of new mathematics and improved instruments. We do not know if the device was a unique masterpiece or just one of many. All that remains is a corroded relic, its gears frozen, its purpose half-guessed by scholars working from X-rays and CT scans. Picture a world where that knowledge had not been lost, where complex machines, durable concrete, fire that burned on water, and clean cities had persisted, improved, and spread. How different might history have been? But that is not our world. Ours is a world shaped by gaps, by the loss and recovery of knowledge, by the rhythms of forgetting and rediscovering. There is an eerie humility in this realization. The past is littered with ruins that whisper of things we can barely comprehend. The Pantheon dome, the Roman roads, the silent gears of Antikythera, the vanished flames of Greek fire, each is a testament to human ingenuity and to the strange vulnerability of what we know. The debate continues. Some historians argue that these losses were inevitable, the result of shifting priorities and changing societies. Others point to contingency, to the accidents of war, plague, or migration that snuffed out the last embers of a tradition. Some suggest that the very complexity of knowledge makes it brittle. The more advanced a technology, the more it depends on networks of people, materials, and ideas. Break the web, and the knowledge dissolves. The honest answer is that we don't know all the reasons. The mystery remains unsolved. What is certain is this: knowledge is precious, and it is fragile. It must be transmitted, preserved, renewed again and again. When the chain is broken, what was once mundane can become mysterious, even miraculous. This is what makes the pattern so haunting. The loss of concrete, the fading of road building, the extinction of fire and gears and healing hands, these are not just technical failures. They are human stories. Stories of forgetting, of silence, of lives lived in the aftermath of loss. Imagine a medieval traveler picking their way through mud where once stone roads gleamed. Imagine a surgeon fumbling for a technique once described in a text now lost or unread. Imagine a city dweller enduring the stench of waste in streets where clean water once flowed. The past is not just a record of what was achieved, but of what was surrendered, sometimes without even realizing it. And yet, there's also beauty in this fragility. What was lost can sometimes be found again. The ruins inspire curiosity, the gaps invite investigation. Scholars pore over ancient texts, engineers analyze crumbling domes, chemists experiment with volcanic ash and seawater, historians puzzle over cryptic diagrams. Each rediscovery is a triumph, a reminder that the story is not over. But think about what might still be missing. How many inventions, methods, and insights have simply vanished, unrecorded or unrecognized? How much of the world's potential lies dormant, waiting to be remembered? Here's where it gets really interesting. The pattern is not unique to the ancient or medieval world. Even today, knowledge is fragile. Digital data can be corrupted, servers lost, expertise concentrated in the minds of a few. The world changes quickly, and what seems permanent can dissolve in a generation. Are you seeing the pattern? What will future generations wonder about us? What will they find mysterious, irreproducible, or lost? Our plastics, our electronics, our medicines, our languages, what will survive, and what will become the next Pantheon, the next Antikythera, the next Greek fire? The answer is that we don't know, and we may never know. But that is what makes history so profound. It is not just a record of progress, but of amnesia. Not just of what was built, but of what was forgotten. As you drift further into the night, let the gentle melancholy of these losses settle over you. The silence of vanished knowledge is not just emptiness. It is a testament to the preciousness of what survives. The Pantheon dome still stands. The Roman roads still trace faint lines across the countryside. The Antikythera mechanism, rescued from the sea, still turns in the minds of those who study it. What we know is always provisional. The chain of human memory is long, but never unbroken. And this brings us to something even more haunting. The most mysterious time gaps may not be in the distant past, but in our own story, in the memories we cannot access, in the knowledge we are losing without even knowing it. Think about that for a moment. What will be lost to time? Picture this. You're lying in the quiet dark, sleep just beginning to gather at the edges of your mind. I want you to try something gentle. Reach back, as far as you can, into your own memory. What is the very earliest thing you can recall? Not a story someone told you, not a photograph you've seen, an actual memory, experienced from behind your own eyes. Maybe it's a flash of color, a fragment of a room, a moment with a parent, or a strange feeling of being carried. When was it? How old were you? For most people, the answer will land somewhere between ages 3 and 4. For a few, perhaps a single blurred image from age 2.5, or a feeling unanchored, atmospheric might shimmer up from the depths. But before that, nothing. Not a single day, not a single hour. The first 1,000 days of your existence, the days when you learn to recognize faces, to smile, to crawl, to speak, are simply gone. Erased. And it doesn't end there. For nearly everyone, the years from ages 4 to 7 are only slightly less shadowed. A few scattered memories, perhaps. The taste of a particular food, a flash of sunlight on a garden wall, a voice calling from another room. But the story of your own life, as you remember it, begins startlingly late. Your personal prehistory stretches from birth to around age 3, sometimes 3.5, a gap of more than 1,000 days. For some, even longer. Think about that for a moment. We speak so often of history's lost ages, of vanished civilizations and forgotten scripts, but perhaps the most mysterious gap of all is the one each of us carries inside, a silence at the beginning of our own story. Psychologists have a name for this phenomenon, childhood amnesia, or, as it's sometimes called, infantile amnesia. The term itself is a little haunting, a label for the strange fact that, though we live those early years, we cannot remember them. Sigmund Freud was the first to give it a formal name, calling it childhood amnesia in 1899, as he puzzled over why his patients, and indeed everyone, seemed to have no memories from before the age of 3 or 4. Freud, ever the explorer of the unconscious, wondered what secrets might be buried in that darkness. But here's what's really fascinating. This amnesia is nearly universal. It doesn't matter where you're born, what language you speak, whether you grow up in a city or a forest or a desert. Nearly all humans, around 99% by some estimates, cannot recall anything from those first 3 years. Even the few who claim earlier memories are usually recalling stories told by others or reconstructing fragments from later in life. And yet those years are not empty. Far from it. In fact, infancy and early childhood are periods of staggering growth and learning. By the age of 3, a child has usually learned to walk, to speak in full sentences, to recognize dozens of faces, to feel attachment and fear and joy. The brain is making new connections at a rate that will never be matched again, up to 1 million new neural connections per second in the first years of life. Picture a newborn, eyes wide, soaking in the world. The brain, though small, about 350 grams at birth, only a quarter of adult size, is already busy. By age 2, it will have reached about 80% of its adult volume. The child is learning languages, social cues, motor skills, all without conscious effort. And yet, when that same child grows up, none of these experiences will be accessible to her adult mind. Why? What is happening in those years that makes the memories so fragile, so easily lost? Are they truly gone, vanished like lost cities beneath the sea, or are they simply inaccessible, buried perhaps, but not erased? Here's where it gets even more mysterious. Scientists have shown that infants can and do form memories. In one remarkable set of experiments, researchers read a specific story to mothers in the final weeks of pregnancy. The Cat in the Hat, for example, read aloud twice a day. After birth, the newborns were given a way to choose between hearing the familiar story and a new one, simply by changing their sucking pattern on a pacifier. Time and again, the babies showed clear recognition and preference for the story they'd heard in the womb. Memory, then, was present even before birth, before the first breath, the first cry. And that's just the beginning. By 6 months old, infants can remember the faces of strangers shown only briefly. At 9 months, they can recall the location of hidden objects, demonstrating a kind of spatial memory. By age 2, children can learn and repeat complex sequences, recognize songs, mimic adults, remember routines and rituals. The machinery of memory is clearly operating. But something is different. These early memories, though demonstrably present at the time, do not last. A child who remembers a toy hidden under a blanket at age 1 will have no conscious memory of that event at age 5. The memory is there, and then it is gone. The answer, as is often the case in neuroscience, is complicated. One major clue lies in the structure of the brain itself. The hippocampus, a small, seahorse-shaped structure deep within each hemisphere, is crucial for forming and storing long-term, autobiographical memories. the kind that allow you to recall not just facts, but experiences lived from the first-person perspective. At birth, the hippocampus is not fully developed. In fact, it continues to mature throughout early childhood, only reaching a more adult-like state around age 3 or 4. MRI studies have shown that the volume and connectivity of the hippocampus increased dramatically in those first years, and that the patterns of brain activity associated with memory formation shift as the child grows. Before this maturation, memories are stored in a more fragmented, less durable way, more like a series of impressions than a coherent narrative. Think about what that means. The experiences of your early life are not so much erased as never properly recorded in the first place, not in the way your adult mind would recognize. The you that remembers is still under construction, but the story doesn't end with the hippocampus. Some researchers believe that another key ingredient is needed for autobiographical memory: language. Before a child develops the words to describe their experiences, those experiences remain unanchored, felt perhaps, but not woven into the tapestry of a personal story. When a child begins to speak in sentences, usually around age 2 or 3, they also begin, slowly, to create a narrative self. The earliest memories that survive into adulthood are almost always tied to language, an event that could be described or was described at the time. This is what makes childhood amnesia so remarkable. It is not a simple case of forgetting, as we might forget where we left our keys or the name of a classmate from long ago. It is a structural developmental phenomenon, something built into the way memory itself emerges from the growing brain. And yet, the analogy to collective human history is striking. For tens of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans lived, loved, hunted, gathered, and learned. The capacity for language, for tool-making, for art was present. But for a long time, almost none of it was recorded. No cave paintings, no carvings, no artifacts that survived the ages. The record is silent, not because nothing happened, but because the means to preserve experience, whether in memory or in material form, had not yet matured. The gap is not a void, but a threshold, a transformation. And perhaps that's the point. Just as the child's brain must pass through a silent phase before it can weave a narrative of self, humanity as a species seems to have passed through long periods of potential before the explosion of culture, art, and memory that we see in the archaeological record. The silence is not empty, but full of possibility. The period before memory is not nothingness, but becoming. Here's the thing: even as adults, our memories are not fixed, but fluid. We forget far more than we remember. Each day, countless experiences fade, dissolve, are overwritten. And yet we think of ourselves as continuous, as if the story of our lives were an unbroken thread. But in truth, the thread is knotted, interrupted, sometimes lost altogether. We are creatures of gaps. The phenomenon of childhood amnesia is something we carry within us, a reminder that memory, both personal and collective, is always partial, always haunted by what cannot be recalled. But what does it feel like, this absence at the root of self? For some, it is simply a curiosity. For others, it is strangely unsettling, the realization that years of one's own life are inaccessible, as if lived by a stranger. We rely on photographs, on family stories, on old toys or clothes to fill in the blanks. But these are not memories, they are reconstructions, echoes. And yet the child you once were is not truly lost. The attachments formed in infancy, the love of a parent, the comfort of a favorite blanket, the fear of a loud noise, shape the adult you become. Early experiences leave traces, not as stories, but as patterns of feeling, of expectation, of reaction. Psychologists call these implicit memories. Memories that influence us without being consciously accessible. The sense of safety or danger, the way we respond to stress, the ease with which we trust others, all may have roots in those vanished years. Think about that for a moment. Who you are at the deepest level is shaped by memories you cannot recall. There is something haunting and beautiful about this. The self is continuous, but the story is not. The person you are today is both the inheritor of forgotten experiences and the narrator of remembered ones. The gap is not a flaw. It is a part of the design. Some researchers have tried to probe the boundaries of childhood amnesia more precisely. In one study, psychologists interviewed children at different ages about recent events, birthday parties, trips to the zoo, the birth of a sibling. When the same children were asked again years later, most could not recall events from before age 3, and even memories from ages 4 to 6 faded rapidly. By age 8, only about 35% of memories from age 3 survived, and by age 10, even fewer remained. The curtain of amnesia is not a hard wall, but a receding fog. But not all is lost. Certain kinds of memories, those that are repeated, emotionally charged, or told and retold by adults, have a better chance of survival. The story of the time you got lost in a supermarket, or the day a new sibling came home, may persist if it is woven into family lore. But even these are fragile. Over time, the details shift, the feelings fade, and the memory becomes more story than recollection. The honest answer is that we don't know exactly why childhood amnesia is so persistent, or why it fades at different rates for different people. The debate continues, with some researchers emphasizing the role of brain maturation, others the importance of language, and still others the influence of social interaction, how memories are rehearsed and reinforced through conversation. Some studies suggest that cultures which talk more to children about the past produce adults with slightly earlier first memories, but the difference is measured in months, not years. What we do know is that even the best documented memories from early childhood are rare. In large studies, the average age of the first autobiographical memory is around 3.5, with a range from 2.5 to 5. Childhood amnesia, then, covers at least 1,000 days of life, and often more. That's about 15% of an average lifespan. Gone, inaccessible. The parallels to collective human experience are striking. Just as our species passed through long ages of potential before the record of culture appears, each of us passes through a phase of silent development before the story of self begins. The capacity exists, the record does not. But here's where it gets really interesting. The pattern is not unique to humans. Other primates also show signs of childhood amnesia, though the details differ. Rhesus monkeys, for example, can remember events from infancy for a few months, but these memories fade rapidly as the animals mature. The phenomenon seems to be tied to the maturation of the hippocampus and related brain structures, a developmental trade-off, perhaps, between the plasticity needed for early learning and the stability needed for long-term memory. Some researchers propose that forgetting early experiences is not a failure, but an adaptation. In the rapidly changing world of infancy, memories may quickly become obsolete, outdated as the brain reorganizes itself in response to new experiences. The child's mind is not a recording device, but a builder, constantly revising and rewriting itself. And perhaps that's the point. The gap at the beginning of memory is not a loss, but a transformation. A necessary silence before the emergence of narrative selfhood. The child becomes an individual not by accumulating memories, but by crossing a threshold, by passing from a world of impressions to a world of stories. There is comfort in this. The silence at the beginning of our lives is not emptiness, but preparation. The forgotten years are the soil in which the self takes root. The gap is not an accident, but a phase of becoming. Think of the patterns we see in history. The long ages of stasis, the sudden bursts of creativity, the silences that precede innovation. These are not just accidents or failures. They are modes of development, pauses before the leap, necessary gaps before emergence. Something we carry within us. And so as you drift further into the night, let yourself feel the wonder of your own hidden history. The years you cannot recall are not lost. They are woven into the fabric of who you are. The silence at the beginning is not absence, but potential, a reservoir from which the self emerges. The pattern repeats in every life. Gaps and silences, forgetting and awakening, stasis and transformation. The mystery of childhood amnesia is not just a quirk of biology, but a window into something profound about consciousness itself. What else, after all, is a mind but a story told against the backdrop of forgetting? What else is history but the record of what survives the silence? Perhaps the gaps, personal and collective, are not failures, but the ground from which new forms of awareness arise. The silences are not empty, but full of becoming. And as you lie here, surrounded by the gentle dark, let that thought settle in. The gaps are not just out there, in the distant past. They are here, inside you, woven into the texture of your own story. Each of us is a living testament to the power of emergence, the beauty of transformation, and the quiet necessity of forgetting. And perhaps that's the point. These patterns of silence and emergence, of forgetting and awakening, may tell us something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. The mystery is not just in the vanished ages of humanity, but in the depths of our own forgotten beginnings. Think about that for a moment. Let yourself drift on the gentle current of unremembered days, trusting that what is forgotten is not wasted, but transformed. The gap within is not a flaw in your story, but the threshold that made your story possible at all. And so we carry the mystery forward, each of us, a vessel of memory and forgetting, a keeper of silences both ancient and new. Picture this. It's late. The world outside your window has gone quiet. The last lights in the neighboring houses flicker out one by one until the streets are bathed in darkness and silence. You lie here, feeling your breath slow. The weight of the covers settles around you like the centuries themselves. And, in this moment, you find yourself on the threshold of something as mysterious and profound as any lost city or vanished civilization. Every night, as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun, you approach a kind of dissolution, a gap in your own story. Consciousness, which feels so solid and continuous during waking hours, begins to fray. The world grows fuzzy at the edges. Thoughts drift, then dissolve, and then nothing. For most of human history, people have wondered about this nightly vanishing act. What is sleep, really? Where do we go when we are no longer ourselves? The ancient Greeks imagined sleep and death as siblings, Thanatos and Hypnos, two silent gods who visited mortals in the dark. In India, the Upanishads spoke of a third state, beyond waking and dreaming, where the self is lost and yet somehow preserved. The mystery remains haunting. Here's the thing. We spend about 1/3 of our lives in this state, around 26 years, give or take, for the average person. 26 years. That's longer than the entire reign of Augustus in Rome, longer than many empires have lasted. Think about what that means. A full third of our existence is spent in a state we barely remember, in a gap where the self dissolves and time disappears. And perhaps that's as it should be. When you close your eyes tonight, you are reenacting a ritual older than history. For as long as humans have walked the earth, perhaps as long as any animal has moved and breathed, there has been this need to surrender, to let go, to cross a threshold from wakefulness into the unknown. The pattern is so universal, so deeply woven into life itself, that it rarely strikes us as puzzling. But it is puzzling. Why should a creature need to become helpless for hours at a time, every single day? Some mysteries are so familiar, we forget to be amazed by them. Let's look closer. Sleep is not one uniform state, but a sequence of stages, each with its own character and purpose. Scientists describe 4 main stages, cycling through the night in roughly 90-minute rhythms. The first 2 are light transitional, easy to wake from. The third is deep, known as slow-wave sleep. The fourth is REM, rapid eye movement, where dreaming is most vivid and the brain's activity echoes wakefulness in a strange, flickering dance. It was only in 1953 that REM sleep was discovered. Before that, the architecture of sleep was invisible, its stages hidden, its functions guessed at, but not seen. Think about that. Within living memory, the very landscape of our nightly journey was a blank map, uncharted and mysterious. But even now, with EEG machines and brain scans, much remains unsolved. During slow-wave deep sleep, the brain's electrical activity slows to a kind of rolling, synchronized tide. This is the phase where, according to most accounts, consciousness as we know it vanishes. There is no sense of self, no inner monologue, no passage of time. You lie down at midnight, and the next thing you know, it's morning. Hours have passed. Where did you go? The honest answer is that we don't know. Some researchers argue that in these deep stages, the very circuits that generate the sense of, the networks that bind together memory, perception, and identity are temporarily silenced. The self dissolves, not by accident, but by design. It is a nightly unmaking, followed by a reconstitution at dawn. And this is where it gets really interesting. This gap, the hours of lost time, the dissolution of self, is not a problem to be solved. It is a function, a necessity. Without it, we cannot survive. Animals deprived of sleep for more than a week, about 11 days, suffer catastrophic breakdowns. In laboratory studies, rats forced to stay awake beyond this threshold die, even when given food and water. Humans, too, begin to unravel after just a few days without sleep. hallucinations, memory failures, personality changes, even microsleeps where the brain simply shuts down for seconds at a time, regardless of the will. The evidence is written in the body, in the brain, in the simple fact that every creature with a nervous system seems to need this gap. Jellyfish, who have no brains at all, show periods of quiescence that resemble sleep. Drosophila, the humble fruit fly, will die if kept awake too long. Sleep is older than memory, older than language, older than the stories we tell about ourselves. And yet, for all its antiquity, sleep is not just a pause. It is a time of intense activity, hidden, silent, but essential. During sleep, especially in the deep stages, the brain performs maintenance that wakefulness cannot. Waste products are flushed away, synaptic connections are pruned or strengthened, and, most remarkably, memories are consolidated. Picture the hippocampus, a small, seahorse-shaped region deep in the brain. During the day, it acts as a temporary holding area, storing the raw footage of experience. But at night, during sleep, especially in the slow wave phases, the hippocampus replays the day's events. Electrical patterns echo the learning and navigation of waking life. Some memories are transferred to the cortex for long-term storage. Others are discarded. This slow, methodical integration is what allows learning to stick, what makes forgetting selective and not total, what lets us wake up changed. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. If you don't sleep after learning something new, if you pull an all-nighter before an exam, for example, much of what you tried to learn will simply vanish. The neural traces fade, unanchored by the nightly consolidation process. In a sense, the gap is not empty. It is the crucible in which the self is reforged. Some researchers think sleep is evolution's answer to the problem of information overload. The waking brain is a sponge for stimulus, but also for noise and distraction. Sleep is the workshop where the essential is separated from the trivial, where the narrative of self is edited, revised, and made coherent. Others argue that sleep's primary purpose is cellular repair, immune function, or metabolic maintenance, and that memory consolidation is a fortunate side effect. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. The answer is complicated. And it may well be that sleep serves many masters at once. But here's what's really fascinating. The daily gap of sleep mirrors the larger patterns we've seen in history and prehistory. There are long periods of apparent stasis when nothing seems to change. Then bursts of reorganization, moments when the old is dissolved and something new emerges. The gap is not just absence, but transformation. Compare that to the prehistoric time gaps we've discussed. Epochs when anatomically modern humans existed, but left few traces. Thousands of years when innovation stalled, only to be followed by sudden explosions of creativity, new tools, new art, new ways of being. The pattern repeats, not just across centuries, but in every 24 hours of our lives. Think about what that means. Every night you entrust yourself to the unknown. You surrender awareness, lay down your story, and cross the threshold into a state where you are, in a very real sense, not yourself. And then, hours later, you emerge, not quite the same as before. The brain has reorganized itself. The body has healed. Memories have been sifted, some kept, some lost. The self is reconstituted, familiar, yet subtly changed. A kind of trust. That is what sleep requires. To let go, to dissolve, to trust that the self will return. It is the oldest faith, older than any religion or philosophy. Each night you enact a miniature version of the gaps that haunt our history, the silences where something is lost and something else is found. Let's delve a little deeper into the architecture of this nightly journey. The 4 stages of sleep repeat in cycles, each lasting about 90 minutes. In a typical 8-hour night, you will pass through 4 to 6 such cycles. The first part of the night is dominated by slow-wave deep sleep, the phase where consciousness is almost entirely absent. Later cycles feature longer periods of REM sleep where vivid dreams unfold. REM sleep is especially intriguing. In this stage, discovered less than a lifetime ago, the brain's activity is nearly identical to wakefulness. The eyes dart beneath closed lids. Muscles are paralyzed, perhaps to prevent us from acting out our dreams. Most people spend about 2 hours per night in REM, totaling more than 6 years across a lifetime. 6 years spent in a world of phantoms, where logic dissolves and impossible things seem ordinary. And yet, even in dreams, the self is unstable. Identities shift, time distorts. The boundaries between self and world blur. The dreaming mind is both creator and spectator, both subject and object. In REM sleep, the brain experiments with possibilities, rehearses scenarios, weaves fragments of memory into stories that rarely survive the morning. The gap is not just a pause, but a theater of transformation. Outside the laboratory, cultures have long tried to make sense of this nightly dissolution. Some imagined that dreams were messages from the gods, or journeys of the soul. Others saw sleep as a time when the spirit left the body, traveling to distant lands or joining the ancestors. The language of sleep is one of thresholds, crossings, and returns, a daily enactment of death and rebirth. But modern science, for all its tools, still cannot answer the most basic questions. Why do we need to lose ourselves so completely? Why is the gap so absolute, so total? Why not simply rest without the erasure of self? The honest answer is that we don't know, and we may never know, but here's what we do know. Without the gap, nothing works as it should. Memory falters. Learning grinds to a halt. The immune system weakens. The body itself begins to fail. Sleep deprivation is not just unpleasant, it is catastrophic. After 72 hours without sleep, most people experience severe cognitive impairment, slurred speech, paranoia, even hallucinations. After 11 days, the longest recorded period in controlled settings, the body begins to shut down. In animals, death is inevitable. Sleep is, in this sense, non-negotiable. It is the nightly price we pay for consciousness. The self must be surrendered so that it can be restored. And perhaps that's as it should be. Think about the paradox. We spend a third of our lives in a state where we do not exist, at least not in any way we can remember. Yet, without that state, the very continuity of self would collapse. The gap is not a flaw in our design, but the foundation on which the self is built. Some researchers propose that this nightly dissolution is the brain's way of integrating experience. During the day, the world is too much with us, too rich, too chaotic, too overwhelming. At night, the noise is quieted. The brain can sift, sort, and make sense of what has happened. The self is not simply preserved during sleep, but reorganized, updated, made ready for the challenges of a new day. Others suggest that sleep is necessary for physical repair. Growth hormone is released primarily at night. Cells divide and replace themselves. The immune system marshals its forces, searching for invaders, repairing damage, preparing for the unknown. The body is not idle, but hard at work behind the veil of unconsciousness. The answer is probably both. The mystery remains unsolved. There is something haunting about this. The most essential parts of life, the preservation of memory, the repair of the body, the very continuity of self, happen when we are not there to witness them. The gap is where the work gets done. The silence is what makes the story possible. Compare that to the gaps in history, in prehistory, in childhood. The silences are not failures, but necessary spaces for transformation. The world of the Bronze Age disappears and something new emerges. The child forgets the years before memory, and the self is born. The sleeper dissolves, and the dreamer awakens. The pattern repeats. This is what makes the nightly gap so remarkable. It is not just a biological function, but a metaphor for all the ways in which forgetting, dissolving, and pausing make change possible. The world is not built by continuous action, but by rhythms, advance and retreat, presence and absence, memory and forgetting. Think about what happens when the gap is denied. The world becomes static, brittle, unable to renew itself. Without sleep, the brain cannot learn. Without pauses in history, societies cannot reinvent themselves. Without forgetting, the self is overwhelmed by the weight of everything that has ever happened. The gap is a blessing, a kind of trust. You let go, not knowing what will happen. You surrender, not knowing if you will return the same. And yet each morning you emerge transformed, reorganized, renewed. The self is not a fixed thing, but a process, a story told anew each day, against the backdrop of forgetting. There is peace in this. Acceptance. The silence of sleep is not emptiness, but potential. The dissolution of self is not loss, but preparation. Each night, you cross a threshold that countless generations have crossed before you, trusting in the cycle, trusting in the return. The architecture of sleep is written in every cell, every gene, every ancient story ever told about the night. It is a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but lived. The daily gap is sacred, necessary, and perhaps beautiful. As you lie here, surrounded by darkness, let the rhythm of your breath echo the rhythms of sleep. The cycles of the night, the dissolving and remaking of the self, the ancient trust that holds you as you drift away. Think about that for a moment. The world will wait. The work of memory, of healing, of integration will go on without your conscious oversight. You do not need to remember every moment, every detail, every loss. The gap is doing its work, quietly, gently, beneath the surface. And this brings us back to the larger story. The gaps in history, the silences in childhood, the nightly dissolution of self, all are modes of transformation. They are not failures, but thresholds. Not emptiness, but becoming. The pattern repeats in every life, every night, every civilization. Presence gives way to absence, structure dissolves, and from the silence, something new arises. Tonight, as you approach your own gap, the dissolution of self that is sleep, allow yourself to trust. Let go of the need to remember, to hold on, to be present at every moment. The gap is not your enemy. It is your oldest companion. The darkness is not a void, but a womb. Out of nothing comes everything, and perhaps that's as it should be. Let yourself drift, allow the self to dissolve, trust in the return. As we approach our own nightly gap, let us consider what these mysteries might mean for who we are and who we might become. The story continues, in silence, in sleep, in the gaps that make all stories possible. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might be thinking, but what if the gaps aren't real? What if the silences in our story are illusions, tricks of the light, shadows cast by the passage of time, rather than true absences in the arc of human creativity? This is an honest and necessary question. In history, the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Sometimes the quiet in the record is not because nothing happened, but because what was made was too fragile to last. Here's the thing. The world our ancestors inhabited was built not just of stone and bone, but of wood, fiber, leather, hide, materials that slip easily into decay, dissolve into the soil, are eaten by insects, or blown away by wind and water. Picture a spear of acacia wood, carved with care, used to hunt or to tell stories, then left behind. Picture a woven pouch of grass fibers, a child's toy made from animal sinew, a set of drums with stretched skin, rhythms echoing into the night. After 40,000 years, after 100,000 years, what trace would remain? Almost nothing. Archaeologists call this taphonomic bias, the tendency for the archaeological record to preserve only what resists decay. Stone tools survive, bones fossilize, but the rest, almost all of it, vanishes. The result is a kind of haunting silence, an illusion of stasis, when in truth the world may have been alive with innovation. Think about what that means. 90% of what was made, of what was used or cherished, might simply have disappeared, erased by time. This is what makes the so-called creative explosion, the sudden flowering of cave paintings, beads, bone flutes, and carved figurines in Europe around 40,000 years ago, so compelling and perhaps so misleading. The truth is, European caves are unusually kind to fragile things. They are cool, dark, and dry, sheltering objects from rot and sunlight. In sites like Chauvet and Lascaux, pigments remain vivid, charcoal drawings survive, ivory carvings endure. But elsewhere, on the open plains, in humid forests, in the deserts of Africa, these same creations might have dissolved within a season, leaving only the vaguest shadow. Compare that to Africa, where the roots of our species run deepest. The African Middle Stone Age stretches back at least 300,000 years, covering a vast expanse of time and space. Yet the record is patchy. Sites are harder to find, harder to excavate, and much less studied than their European counterparts. For every famous cave in France or Spain, there are hundreds of African rock shelters whose stories remain unread, their secrets locked away by distance, climate, or the sheer scale of the continent. And yet, the evidence is growing. At Border Cave, on the border of South Africa and Eswatini, archaeologists uncovered a tiny shell bead, drilled for stringing, dated to around 76,000 years ago. In Blomba's cave, ochre was ground and engraved, and beads of nacreous shells were pierced and worn, 75,000 years ago or more. These are not the signs of sudden revolution, but of slow, steady emergence, a gradual flowering of symbolic behavior, of art, of meaning. The record at Pinnacle Point hints at the use of heat-treated stone tools as early as 164,000 years ago, while Sibudu Cave has yielded evidence of compound adhesives and bedding made from grass and leaves. Here's what's really fascinating. The more we look, the more we find. But the pattern that emerges is not a single dramatic leap, but a mosaic, innovations appearing, disappearing, reappearing across time and place. Some researchers now argue that the revolution model, the idea of a sudden creative explosion, is too simplistic, too Eurocentric. Instead, they propose a gradual emergence model, where the elements of behavioral modernity, art, ritual, technology, innovation, arose piecemeal, over tens of thousands of years, in different places, in different ways. Think about that for a moment. The gap may not be a void, but a gradient, a slow transition, almost invisible when seen from a distance, but rich with detail up close. But here's where it gets complicated. Even our questions about progress, about what counts as a breakthrough or an advance, are shaped by our own biases, by what we value, by what we notice, by what our traditions tell us to seek. The Western narrative of history often prizes the dramatic, the first painting, the oldest flute, the earliest city. But other cultures, other times, may have measured progress differently, by the weaving of cloth, the crafting of baskets, the telling of stories, the bonds of kinship and care. What if our sense of gaps is shaped by what we are looking for? The tools for hunting, the weapons for war, the monuments of stone endure, but the tools for gathering, for cooking, for nurturing, these dissolve. The record of women's labor, of children's play, of ordinary life is mostly absent. The past we see is filtered, incomplete, partial. The mystery is not just what is missing, but what we do not even know to look for. And yet, even when we account for all of this taphonomic bias, preservation, the accidents of discovery, the limits of our own imagination, the genuine puzzle remains. Why did some forms of symbolic behavior, some technologies, some ways of being, appear when they did and not before? Why do we see, across continents and millennia, long ages of apparent stasis followed by bursts of innovation? Why does the record, even when expanded by new finds and new methods, still show patterns of silence and emergence, of forgetting and awakening? The honest answer is that we don't know. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. Some gaps may close as we find more, as we ask better questions, as we look in new places. But others remain stubborn, haunting, unresolved. The leap to painting the walls of Chauvet, to carving the Venus of Hohlefels, to composing the first melodies on bone pipes, these are not easily explained by preservation alone. Picture this: a world alive with possibility, most of it vanished, some of it frozen in time by chance and chemistry, and all of it filtered through our own hopes and assumptions. The story we tell about the past is always a negotiation between evidence and imagination, between what survives and what is lost. So, as we reflect on these alternative perspectives, let's practice humility. The story is more complicated than any single model, more mysterious than any one narrative. The gaps may be less absolute than they appear, sometimes only illusions, sometimes the product of our own blind spots. But the core mystery remains. The emergence of modern behavior, of art and ritual and story, is genuinely puzzling. Even when we adjust for bias and loss, the silence lingers. With these complexities acknowledged, what might these gaps, real or perceived, mean for us tonight? So here we are, conscious beings, suspended between memory and forgetting, story and silence, peering back across a landscape shaped as much by its absences as its remains. The pattern is unmistakable, long epochs where nothing seems to change, punctuated by sudden leaps, each threshold both mysterious and profound. The archaeologist's gap is not so different from the one you cross each night. The silence in the record, the blank spaces between the artifacts, are mirrored by the blank spaces in your own story. Those years before memory, those hours spent in sleep. The pattern repeats. Picture this: 40,000 years ago, a group of people gathered in a cave, somewhere in what is now southern France. Their hands pressed pigment against stone, leaving behind images of bison and lions, shapes that still pulse with meaning across the millennia. For tens of thousands of years before that, there was only silence, hundreds of generations living and dying, leaving almost nothing behind that we can see. And then suddenly, a threshold is crossed. The walls bloom with color and narrative. Here's the thing. We will never know the name of the first dreamer who reached out from the silence and made a mark. We will never know what it felt like in that moment to become more than mere survival, to awaken to story, to beauty, to the power of making something new. The evidence is fragmentary, the gap is vast, but the pattern is ancient. The silence before the song, the blank canvas before the first brushstroke. Something in us recognizes this rhythm, even if we cannot explain it. And that's what makes the mystery so haunting. The gaps are not just problems to be solved or puzzles to be filled in. They are invitations, spaces of possibility. They remind us that emergence is not always gradual or predictable. Sometimes what is most extraordinary arrives not by steady accumulation, but by sudden transformation, by crossing a threshold, by becoming something new. Think about what that means. The 80,000 years between the first appearance of anatomically modern humans and the earliest known cave art is not just a period of waiting. It is a period of becoming, of hidden preparation, of silent integration, as potential gathers in darkness, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The same is true for each of us. The gaps in our own lives, the forgotten years, the pauses, the silent seasons of confusion or uncertainty are not failures. They are phases of integration. Necessary intervals where we dissolve and remake selves, sometimes without even noticing. Picture the way a seed lies dormant in the earth for months, or sometimes years, before it cracks open and grows. Picture the way a person can live for decades with a question, a longing, a hidden capacity, before one day it surfaces in a sudden act, a new direction, a breakthrough. This is the rhythm of becoming. It is written into the architecture of nature, of mind, of history. And we are the descendants of those who crossed the threshold. We carry their awakening within us. The first to paint a bison, the first to carve a bone flute, the first to tell a story by firelight. These are our ancestors, not just by blood, but by spirit. Their passage through the gap made our own possible. To be human is to inherit this gift, the capacity to dwell in mystery, to trust the silence, to become something new without knowing how. The mystery remains open. And that openness is not a flaw, but a gift. If the record were complete, if every step were accounted for, there would be no room left for imagination, for wonder, for the slow work of becoming. And so tonight, as you approach your own small gap, the threshold of sleep, you join a pattern as old as consciousness itself. You surrender to the night, trusting that what is dissolved will return, that what is forgotten will be transformed, that you will awaken on the far side, changed in ways you cannot predict. This is what makes the nightly journey so profound. It links us to the first dreamers, the first storytellers, the first artists and singers and makers. The cycle repeats across continents, across eras, across the quiet boundaries of every human life. Whether you're watching from the high latitudes of Scandinavia, where the sun vanishes for months and the long night is a world unto itself. Whether you're in the heart of Africa, where some of the oldest evidence of symbolic thought, beads, ochre, carved bones, emerged more than 70,000 years ago. Whether you are listening in the Americas, on land once crossed by people who braved the Bering Land Bridge 16,000 years ago, carrying with them only what could be remembered, told, or sung. Or in Oceania, where seafarers launched into the unknown, trusting only in wind, stars, and the wisdom of stories. Wherever you are part of this story. You are the descendant of those who crossed thresholds, across rivers, across deserts, across the silent chasms of forgetting. You carry their resilience and their wonder, their willingness to dwell in uncertainty, to linger in the gap, to trust in what cannot be seen. The same spirit that made the leap from silence to song, from darkness to fire, from survival to meaning. Think about that for a moment. You are a living vessel for emergence. The mystery is inside you as much as it is behind you. The gaps you encounter in memory, in history, in the cycles of sleep and waking are not obstacles to be overcome, but spaces that make transformation possible. And here is the quiet blessing at the heart of it all. You do not have to know what happens in the gap. You do not have to fill every silence, solve every mystery, recall every lost moment. It is enough to trust the pattern, to surrender to the process, to know that even in the absence something is taking root. Let these mysteries follow you into sleep. Let the questions linger, open and gentle like stars scattered across a night sky. Let yourself drift as others have drifted for tens of thousands of years across the threshold, into the gap, into the quiet work of becoming. You are part of this story. Sleep well.